Good morning, guys. What's up? Okay, so today we are on number 6 of our study of Mormonism and Judeo-Freemasonry, and we're on part 2 of um Mormonism and Kabbalah. So, I've been reading this book uh by Owens Joseph Smith and Kabbalah. So, as at the beginning of my show, I am on partial shadow ban. Can be hard to find my videos. You can never find the first three. Um, you can find them all at vincentbrunoshadowban.blogspot.com. It's at the bottom of the screen and it's in the description box. Okay, so what I need to do is I need to find that link so I can spread it and I can put it on my website. So if you give me a second, let me just get the link so I can spread it around. Come on. Okay, got it. Just doing this. Hold on. Hold on. And then I just gotta post it on my timeline and then we'll be ready to start. Okay, let me just start it. Okay, it's on my, give me 1 second. Okay, here I found it. I just gotta share it up. Hello? Yeah, okay, you can hear me now. Okay. Okay, I'm ready. We're gonna watch 2 videos today. One is the one we're watching right now, which we're gonna watch now, which is called Kabbalah in Surprising Places, Joseph Smith's Engagement with Jewish Mysticism. So if you give me a second, let me just get a drink of soda. Okay. All right. So we're reading from Owens, Joseph Smith, and Kabbalah. The Fama proceeded to introduce the history of mysterious individual called C.R. born in 1378. C.R. was the founding father of the Rosicrucian order, a man who had labored long through unrecognized long though unrecognized toward the general reformation now declared. CR, or Christian Rosenkreutz, as he was subsequently identified, had been an illuminated man. As a 16-year-old boy, he had traveled to the East, where the wise received him, as he himself witnessed, not as a stranger, but as one who had been long expected. They called him by his name and showed him other secrets, including an important text called only the Book of M. The boy became skilled in language and translation, so that year following, he translated the Book of M into Latin, which he afterwards brought with him. The book, excuse me, The book M continued to play an important part in the Rosicrucian mythos as one of the treasures. Of course, a vague outline of the story told by Joseph Smith might here also be discerned. CR then traveled across Africa to Spain, and hoping well that since he himself had so well and so profitably spent his time in his travel, that he learned in Europe would. Hoping well that since he himself had so well and so profitably spent his time in his travel, that the learned in Europe would highly rejoice with him, and begin to rule and order all their studies according to those sound and sure foundations. He therefore conferred with the learned in Spain, but it was to them a laughing matter, and being a new thing unto them, they feared that their great names should be lessened if they should now again begin to learn and acknowledge their many years' error. Rejected, Brother CR eventually returned to Germany and quietly established his order among those few men who, through special revelation, should be received into his fraternity. Among these men alone were shared and transmitted the secrets of the order. After death, CR's body was concealed in a tomb and eventually forgotten, but this lost vault, declared the Fama, had around the year 1604 been again found, opened, and entered. Within its miraculously lighted geometric confines, CR's followers discovered an altar, a brass plate upon which were engraved mysterious words and glyphs, several records of the order, and the book M, and now the Fama continued. Like as our door was after so many years wonderfully discovered, also there shall be opened a door to Europe when the wall is removed, which already doth begin to appear, and with great desires expected of many. Howbeit we know after a time there will now be a general reformation, both of divine and human things. Our philosophy also is not a new invention, but as Adam after his fall hath received it, and as Moses and Solomon used it. Give me 1 second. Okay. Okay. Upon close examination, the Fama Fraternitas presented itself more as an allegory than as actual history, and this was probably its intent. The Rosicrucian mythos was connected closely with the mysteries of alchemy, where allegorical legends of buried treasure miraculously rediscovered were particularly prevalent. However, the story was generally interpreted literally, and the excitement it incited grew the following year with the publication of the Second Rosicrucian Manifesto, the Confessio Fraterni, the publication of the Record Rosicrucian Manifesto, the Confessio Fraternitas. This second manifesto repeated the message of the first, interpreting and intensifying it, and added a powerful apocalyptic and prophetic note. A great millennial reformation was at hand, and with it a return to an Adamic knowledge revealed by God. We ought therefore here observe well and make it known unto everyone that God hath certainly and most assuredly concluded to send and grant to the world before her, and with presently thereupon shall ensue such truth, light, life, and glory as the first man Adam had, so then the second had written, and characters are most necessary for all such things. What before times hath been seen, heard, and smelt, now finally shall be spoken and uttered forth, when the world shall awake out of her heavy and drowsy sleep, and with an open heart, bareheaded and barefooted, shall merrily and joyfully meet the new arising sun. 1 year later, in 1616, a third and final Rosicrucian document appeared, the chemical wedding of Christian Rosencreutz. Cast in the form of a long allegory and alchemical symbolism, it bid the wise of Europe approach a sacred royal marriage, a hierogamos of mysterious mystical intent. This day, the royal wedding is. Art thou thereto by birth inclined, and unto joy of God designed? Then mayest thou to the mountains tend, where upon the stately temple stand, and there see all from end to end. The hold on. The Rosicrucian Manifesto caused a furor throughout Europe and England. Individuals espousing sympathy with Rosicrucian ideals published numerous works lauding the Brotherhood's purpose and petitioning acceptance into the order. But to the dismay of all, the Rosicrucian Brotherhood never declared itself, never accepted or acknowledged the many aspirants to its fellowship, and indeed perhaps never even really, at least outwardly, existed. While history has identified both the author of the least of the manifesto, John Valentine Andrea, and a wider group of individuals sharing in Rosicrucian aspirations, the deeper sources and purposes of the movement remain enshrouded in layers of mystery and supposition. Whatever their actual intent or origins, the manifesto crystallized a broad pre-existing alternative, reformative inclination in European society. This was a new/old religious vision steeped in Hermetic, Kabbalistic, alchemical, and in broader definition, Gnostic symbolism, a mythos that had been brewing in the pageant retorted of European retort the pregnant a mythos that had been brewing in the pregnant retort of European creativity over two prior centuries. The tradition's doctrines, imbued as they were with an experimental, experiential, creative, and immensely personal vision, found expression in a peculiar symbolic or hieroglyphic language, an idiom alchemical in nature, but ever more religious, philosophic, and physical chemical in intent, and interwoven in all was a new working of the old sacred mysteries of Kabbalah. This infusion of Kabbalah was aided in the later 17th century by Nor von Rosenroth translation into Latin of several key Kabbalistic works, including large sections of the Zohar, an effort that was immensely influenced in the literate circles devoted to these studies. There followed in the mid to the late 17th century, particularly in England, a alchemical renaissance. During this period, the Hermetic religion of alchemy was augmented by Kabbalistic imagery and fermented by a high spiritual quest for ultimate individual knowledge of God. It was this expansive alchemical Hermetic philosophy into which Isaac Newton and his fellows in the New Royal Society delved. Okay, let's watch the show a little bit.
When I was a kid growing up in Mesa, Arizona, I remember not long after we had moved to Mesa, there was a knock at the door, and a young lady was at the door asking for food for a food drive. And I said, oh, of course. And I went and grabbed some cans out of the pantry, and I gave them to her. And she looked at me and she said, are you in our ward? And I said, what's a ward? And she said, never mind. And then I asked her, I said, oh, are you collecting food for a tzedakah project? And she said, what's a tzedakah project? And I said, it's okay, never mind. And despite that miscommunication, I actually spent a lot of time growing up with Mormon students, friends, colleagues, and was surrounded more by Mormonism, a culture of Mormonism, than Judaism in the small Jewish community that I lived in Mesa, Arizona. And during that time, I never would have imagined that Jewish mysticism would appear in any way in the Mormon tradition. And what I want to talk about today are the ways in which the appearance of Jewish mysticism or Kabbalah in many different places, because we do find it emerging in a lot of surprising locations, maybe shouldn't be as surprising to us after all. The role of Kabbalah in the development of a lot of Jewish and Christian religious forms is something that we see starting in the Middle Ages. And we tend to think of Jewish mysticism as a secret. And as a result, we expect it to be something that only a very few people know about. And it's that perception of Jewish secrecy that I want us to maybe rethink a little bit. Because clearly, Jewish mysticism has been an important way of thinking about Judaism and an important way of thinking about religion and the world for many people, both Jewish and non-Jewish, in particular in various Christian communities since the Renaissance. And this public face of Kabbalah is one that I think is a little bit underappreciated. In fact, there's no reason to think that Kabbalah wouldn't play a role in the development of Mormonism, given that Kabbalah was very available and accessible in English in the first half of the 19th century in the United States. At the time when so much religious creativity was happening in America, when Joseph Smith burst onto the scene, Kabbalah was certainly not a secret. It certainly wasn't something only accessible to Jews. And in fact, in many ways, American Christians were more interested in Kabbalah, especially through Freemasonry, than American Jews were in some cases. And so I want us to think about some of the ways that Kabbalah has been important and some of the ways that Kabbalistic texts have been available by looking at the specific example of the development of Mormonism. Now, I also want to add the little caveat to this talk that in no way is this intended to debunk or confirm or call into question Mormon truth claims about the prophecy of Joseph Smith. Based on Smith's own descriptions of his prophetic method, the argument I'm going to present today works just as well for practitioners and professors of Mormonism as for academics who study it. This is an argument made by Professor Ann Taves at the University of California, Santa Barbara, as well as a recent PhD from there, Dr. Stephen Fleming. And they note that in a sermon that Joseph Smith gave in 1843, he states that he was commanded by God to seek truth wherever it may be found in any tradition in order, quote, to get all of the good in the world and come out a pure Mormon. And part of his prophetic method involved reading widely and studying, and then to put that through a kind of process of refinement, through his own internal process of prophecy, in order to understand the truth that can be extracted from other truths that are found out in the world and in other traditions. So that way of thinking about Mormon truth claims, I think I just want to sort of leave that as a way of imagining how this question of the role of Kabbalah in Mormonism isn't intended as a rejection of Mormon truth claims about their own tradition. So now Mormonism is a really important phenomenon, of course, in the United States. Leo Tolstoy describes Mormonism as the quintessential American religion. And the place of Kabbalah in this tradition tells us a lot about the place of Jewish secret knowledge in the 19th century and in Western Christian society more broadly. The story I want to think about today isn't so much a story about religious truths, it's a story about people and books, and the way that people and books share ideas about the world. So now, this sort of interest in Kabbalah is largely the result of the question of how Jewish revelation is configured in Christian religious discourses. There's a very broad acceptance of the notion historically in 19th century forms of Protestantism, Christianity, and this, of course, is a very long tradition, that Jews were present at Mount Sinai, and therefore are conveyors of divine truths that are central to the construction of Christianity. The embrace of the Old Testament and the embrace of other types of prophetic revelation that was conveyed by Jews to the world is central to Christian self-conceptions. Therefore, when we find the development of a Jewish mystical doctrine, of a secret idea that claims to have been also revealed at Mount Sinai, it's unsurprising that some Christian groups in particular times and places take an interest in that doctrine. And Kabbalah does present itself as exactly that kind of secret. And the way that that secret then plays a role in other religious environments is an interesting phenomenon in the history of religion. So now I'm going to give a quick sort of overview for Mormonism for people who are not familiar with that. Then I'm going to give a quick overview of Kabbalah for people who are not familiar with that. So we'll see how quickly I can get through these two very big topics. So Mormon history, very quickly. Joseph Smith was born in Sharon, Vermont in 1805. And in around 1816, there were a few moves his family had made due to economic hardship, and they end up in Palmyra, New York, an area that was described sometimes with the expression of being the burned over district, because there had been such burning religious fervor in that part of the country. It was a place of tremendous religious creativity, especially among Protestant Christians in the United States. In 1820, Joseph Smith has his first religious vision, in which he is offered forgiveness and the error of other Christian sects is noted to him. And then in 1823, he has a visitation from the angel Moroni describing a gold plate book that's hidden in the hill Cumorah in upstate New York. And it's said to describe the people who used to inhabit North America and to provide, quote, the fullness of the gospel. And in 1827, Smith is given permission to recover these plates and begins to translate them with the seer stones that he had, which he refers to as the Urim and Tumim. These are the gemstones described in the Hebrew Bible that provide prophetic insight. The book is written in what is called Reformed Egyptian, and it's translated over the course of several years with the assistance of a man named Oliver Cowdery, and this book becomes the Book of Mormon. Smith and Cowdery together have a vision of John the Baptist in 1829, in which the Aaronic priesthood, meaning the priesthood of the descendants of Aaron, is conferred upon them. And then in 1830, the Book of Mormon is published. So the basic contents of the Book of Mormon is that it describes events in North America from around the years 600 to 400 BCE. It describes the family of Lehi, a prophet in Jerusalem who leaves Jerusalem before the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE, and they move to North America, and claims that there's then descended the Nephites and the Lamanites who fight wars. It also claims that the appearance describes an appearance of Jesus in the New World. So the issue of the 10 lost tribes in North America, this is a really interesting question, that the Native American peoples were regarded as descendants of the 10 lost tribes. We actually find Jews making this claim not long after Columbus set sail. In the early 15th century, a Jewish exile from Spain named Joseph ben Abraham Halevi makes this claim in a fairly obscure text. He was a Kabbalist from Spain who moved to North Africa and then lived and wrote most of his life in Jerusalem. Also, about 100 years later, this claim was made by none other than Menashe ben Israel, who was an important Jewish statesman, a Kabbalist. He also was the one who argued to Oliver Cromwell that Jews should be allowed to re-enter the British Empire because the Bible predicts that Jews will be gathered in from the four corners of the earth when redemption comes. And how could it be possible for them to be gathered in from the four corners of the earth if they don't inhabit all four corners? And if they're not living in the British Empire, clearly at least one corner is missing. So this was his argument, and Cromwell found that very compelling, and he readmitted Jews at that point since they had previously been expelled from England. As a Canadian, I find this very fortunate. So in 1830, Smith moves to Kirtland, Ohio, and he had a doctrine of continuing revelation. It's not that the Book of Mormon was a singular revelation that he conveyed. He had a notion that there was ongoing revelation, and he recorded many of these revelations in Pearl of Great Price, one composition, and Doctrines and Covenants is another. A temple was built there in Kirtland, but there was a lot of tension with the surrounding population, and so 1836, the Mormons were forced out of Kirtland. And they moved to Illinois, in which they established a city called Nauvoo, from the biblical Hebrew word for beautiful. And this quickly becomes a large and powerful place. It was a settlement of about 10,000 people fairly quickly, and by 1845, there were about 15,000 people, nearly the size of Chicago. So Nauvoo was a really important location where some of the last work was done by Joseph Smith. They also had a successful mission spreading Mormonism to England. They constructed a temple in Nauvoo. And in 1843, Smith had two very important final revelations, or revelations towards the end of his life. One about the baptism of the dead, and another about polygyny, or plural marriage. And in 1844, Smith announced an intention to run for the president. He gives a really important discourse that we're going to talk about in a few minutes called the King Follett Discourse. And there's some question about ordering the destruction of an opposition newspaper, which then led to other kinds of controversy. He was imprisoned, and on June 27th of that year, Smith and his brother Hiram were killed by a mob. So in addition to the Book of Mormon and Pearl of Great Price and Doctrines and Covenants, there were other things that were published in a newspaper, a periodical in Nauvoo called Times and Seasons. And this provides an incredibly rich wealth of data for the study of religion in this period and the study of Mormonism. We also have really meticulous record keeping by the Mormon Church itself. And what I have to say is the best research website I have ever seen for the study of a religion. Really tremendous digital access to manuscripts, and it's really impressive. And so it's with some of the material from this collection that I want to think today. But now, very basically, what is Kabbalah that I'm going to suggest played a role in the development of Joseph Smith's religious discourse? Kabbalah emerges in the Middle Ages, around the 12th and 13th centuries, first in southern France and then in Spain. And the most famous composition to emerge from medieval Kabbalah is the Sefer HaZohar, or Book of Splendor. This is Madonna's favorite book. But there were many, many other texts, literally thousands of folios written in Hebrew and Aramaic in the Middle Ages that relate Kabbalistic ideas, often in very accessible form. The Zohar claims to be a book written by the 2nd century sage Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, describing the mysteries of the Torah, and that it was hidden, lost really to the Jewish tradition, but rediscovered in the 13th century. And the tradition holds that it was, at least the textual evidence holds, that a man named Moses de Leon had a manuscript of the Zohar that he then copied sections of and shared with his friends, and it spread that way. So a hidden book come to light. Kabbalah is based on this notion of the doctrine of the 10 divine emanations, or 10 divine luminosities, called sphirot. Sphirot refers to these luminous entities within God rather than spheres. It's not from the same Greek word for sphere. It's from the Hebrew word sapir, which means luminous. It's also where we get the word sapphire. According to the Kabbalists, the 10 Sphirot emerge from an infinite God, an ineffable, unknowable God called Ein Sof, or the endless. These 10 Sphirot are emanated from God, and then from there, the world is emanated in a continuum of being, this sort of emanation from God through the Sphirot and into the world. They also argue that Jewish people have a divine soul endowed in their body. We don't find this in the rabbinic tradition, in the Talmud, in the Midrash, or in the Bible. Where we find this really appearing is in the mid-13th century among Kabbalists. And they also describe that because of these divine souls within their bodies, through the practice of Jewish law with their bodies, they're able to impact the 10 Sphirot, causing them to draw together and drawing divine blessing down into the world, from Ein Sof into the material realm. And it's the material plane where the practice of Judaism takes place, observing the Sabbath, observing the laws of kosher food, prayer. All of these things are done ultimately with the body, and Kabbalists provide a religious discourse for understanding the power and the impact of these religious practices. That notion that human behaviors impact the divine realm is referred to as theurgy. And the theurgic principle is a really important shared idea between Mormonism and Judaism. And also both do have a discourse of human incarnation. For the Kabbalists, they have this notion that Jews are manifestation of the divine in their body, that they sustain the world through the procreation of new Jewish bodies via sacred marriage and through the practice of Jewish law. This is a fairly radical reformulation of the rabbinic tradition. And what's remarkable about it is how quickly it was embraced. The Zohar goes on in a few hundred years to become a canonized text. Really, alongside the Bible and the Talmud is the Zohar. No other text in the history of rabbinic Judaism has attained that kind of status. This Kabbalistic tradition goes on to have sort of many moments of fame, both within rabbinic circles and in Christian circles. Texts are translated into Latin in the Renaissance, and then translations into English happen in the early modern period. So now some of the basic theological claims in Mormonism that I think bear affinities to Kabbalistic ideas. One is the notion of priesthood and the ordinances thereof. So the idea of the Aaronic priesthood, or priesthood of Aaron, the priesthood of Melchizedek, and the priesthood of Enoch. These sort of three levels of priesthood and the emphasis on religious ritual having an impact on the divine realm and having, in response to that, an impact in the cosmic realm. For Kabbalists, Jews maintain the fabric of being itself. They maintain the universe through their religious practices. There are affinities between that and Mormon notions of priesthood ordinances. The divinity of the soul and its connection to God. Obviously, that's not a uniquely Kabbalistic idea, but it's one that emerges in Mormonism in ways that are evocative of Kabbalistic ideas. Also, notions of three levels in the divine world and in the afterlife, the celestial, terrestrial, and telestial. In Mormonism, there's a three-level notion of the divine realm as well, operative in Kabbalah. The sanctity of marriage and procreation as a sacred duty connected to the divine realm. This is something we find emphasized in a really pronounced way in Mormonism and in Kabbalah. Ongoing revelation and the utility of truth in altered forms in other places. Kabbalists also regarded themselves as having access to divine revelation. And Kabbalists in some of their books are referred to as being a Navi, a prophet. And despite the fact that in more conservative sectors of the rabbinic tradition, prophecy is said to end with the end of biblical revelation, Kabbalists are not afraid to use the term prophet in reference to themselves. The notion of a bond between matter and spirit, emanating from the connection of everything to God, and thus the value of the practice of law and ritual. This is something we find in both traditions. As of course, the theurgic principle, the notion of things above and things below, reflecting one another, paralleling one another, and impacting one another. These
are okay, hello? 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 Hello, hello, hello. Hello, there we go. Okay, let's keep reading from Owens. The arcane Hermetic books produced by Christian philosophers during the period circulated widely among the elites in society, among the elite societies and intellects of Europe. These were works composed in the idiom of symbolic language, replete with allegorical pictures hinting at humankind's noble mystery. The hieroglyphic engraving often play at the theme of the complexo oppositorium, opposite seeking union, a motif conveyed by or accompanied with the arcane symbols of sun and moon. In several figures, trumpets herald the new dispensation, an image offered by the Second Rosicrucian Manifesto, emblematic of mankind having again remembered God's message. Angels ascend and descend from heaven. We repeatedly find illustrated a sacred wedding of king and queen, their holy conjunction being often pictured as a carnal coupling, which leads through hermaphroditic forms to a new and regal heavenly being. Here too, we encounter a symbolic beehive. The industry this beehive metaphorically bids, however, was misunderstood in latter days. In its primary context, the industry was a secret, laborious concern of alchemical transmutation, a transformation of dark matter into a pure and vital gold elixir, an alchemical opus performed with the alembic hive of the soul, intimately associating and reigning over all the emblems of this occult hieroglyphic tongue was the supreme all-seeing eye of God, the sacred emblem of a perpetual divine and uncreated intelligence, humankind's single unfailing light. This time, these emblematic books, this philosophy, these are the propagating sources of the symbols finally carved in stone upon Joseph Navu's temple. To thus Hermetic alchemical tradition and it to this Hermetic alchemical tradition and its unique vision alone did they pertain. From it alone came an assertion of their sacred import. Early Mormonism's affinity for and incorporation of the same symbolic motifs strongly evidences its intrinsic link with the Hermetic tradition. The import of myth and metaphor as a vehicle of the Hermetic Kabbalistic tradition cannot be overstated. In Gnostic studies, the function of myth and symbol as a conduit for the expression of primary vision is well accepted, and classical Gnosticism is now usually classified in terms of its mythic motifs. Likewise, with the Hermetic Kabbalistic tradition, the intricate interplay of above and below bred a unique matrix of myths, stories, and symbols, which conveyed by metaphor the savor of a primary and encompassing vision of God and humanity, integrated and developed over several generations, over several hundred years. This Hermetic Kabbalistic mythos reached maturation during the 17th century. It is during the early and Middle Ages of this key century that the mythos most fully flowered, enveloping the separate tradition of Kabbalah, classical Hermeticism, and alchemy. A creative mix of symbols and stories played variation on core archetypal themes during the period. Detailed examination of these is beyond this essay, but there is one thing which runs as a pervasive subtext defining the tradition's fuller mythos, the motif of the mysterium conic or whatever. On earth and in heaven, two paths intertwined. Man and God echoed each other, a flux of conjunctions. Matter and spirit, light and dark, masculine and feminine, all mingled in the mystery, face to face. An array of opposites was personified as vehicles for the metaphor of this conjunction. To these was linked the companion image of the Hieros Gamos. It was a mystery foreshadowed by man and woman in first conjunction as Adam and Eve, proxies of creation's primary conundrum. It became the sacred wedding of the king and queen, the Rex and Regina of alchemy. Of course, there followed a parallel theme of great mysteries knower of the great mysteries knower, the philosopher priest king who was the human mediator of conduction and playing an important role in the specific form of several motifs, particularly those with the occult fraternities, came variations on motifs, particularly those within the occult fraternities, came variations on the story of Christian Rosicrucians, the Book M, the sealed text awaiting translation, the hidden tomb, and the lost buried treasures. Perhaps in imitation of the mysterious Rose Cross brothers, and certainly in rational response to political exigencies, reformative religious aspirations increasingly inclined during the subsequent century towards the formation of occult brotherhoods and societies. Incongruent as it seems, this explosion of occult interest appeared hand in hand with the so called Age of Enlightenment, a group of highly informed Englishmen influenced by, or perhaps sharing in, Rosicrucian aspirations in symbolic language probably engendered the first secret Masonic lodges during the mid 17th century. The earliest generally accepted documentation of a Masonic initiation is found in the diary of Elias Ashmole in 1646. Ashmole, 1617 to 92, was an influential scholar and collector of books, a founding member of the Royal Society, and a man with an unquestionable extensive knowledge of Rosicrucian material. Among the documents preserved in his impressive library are the texts of the Rosicrucian manifestos carefully copied in his own hand. To these manuscripts, Ashmole had appended a letter also in his own hand, but apparently addressed to no one, praising the Rosicrucian fraternity and petitioning admission. By the late 17th century, several occult Hermetic brotherhoods, including Masonic and Rosicrucian societies, existed in England. The relationship these fraternities had to the first Grand Masonic Lodge organized in London in 1717 remain unclear, although noting that Masonry underwent gradual change throughout a period of years stretching from well before 1770 to well after that date. Modern authorities on Masonic history usually mark the beginning of speculative Masonry to the decade usually mark the beginning of speculative Masonry to the decade following the organization of the first Grand Lodge. Not long after this, around 1750, a specifically Rosicrucian order had been incorporated into French Masonry. Within the initiatory structure of the occult lodges, allegorical mystery plays were used to convey through symbolic ritual the grounding mythos of Masonry, a mythos which appeared to have been fundamentally Hermetic Kabbalistic. Though several renditions of Masonic history still emphasize the role of earlier craft guilds as a source of Freemasonry, relatively little evidence supports this claim. Even if one grants the existence of such linkage of 18th century Masonry with earlier craft guilds, this does not diminish the molding forces Hermeticism, alchemy, and Rosicrucianism had on the fraternity's symbolic and philosophic development. Simply put, in 18th century Masonry was forcefully shaped by esoteric Hermetic Kabbalistic traditions. While emphasizing this, I allow that several Masonic lodges eventually evolved with less esoteric underpinnings and much simpler fraternal intentions. Taking note of the increasing influence of Freemasonry in politics and society, German historians began attempting during the later part of the 18th century to trace the historical roots of Masonry. Evidence compiled during the period suggested that roots led not to King Solomon or craft guilds, but to Rosicrucianism. This view was in wide circulation by the early 19th century, and in 1824, the prominent English essayist Thomas de Quincey published a detailed restatement in London Magazine. While A. E. Waite rejected the assertion in 1887, France Yates recently restated a strong case for it. The European phenomenon of Freemasonry, she concluded in 1972, almost certainly was connected with the Rosicrucian movement. Whatever judgment one favors, it remains clear that during the period of Joseph Smith's life, Masonry was not uncommonly believed to be associated with Rosicrucian legacy of alchemical, Kabbalistic, and Hermetic lore and its reformative religious aspirations. Okay, let's listen.
These are discourses between Mormonism and Kabbalism that raise the question of what kind of historical lines of influence there could be between these two traditions. So now, of course, if the Book of Mormon was an uncovering of ancient secrets, it reminds you of the Zohar. But in what way could Joseph Smith had access to these traditions within Judaism? And I would argue that there were really quite a few different points of access for Joseph Smith to have had some exposure to Kabbalistic ideas. One is that Smith had a particular interest in the study of biblical Hebrew, and he studied Hebrew with John Satius in Kirtland in 1835. Joshua Satius was from an important Sephardic Jewish community in New York, but he was living in Ohio, and he was a Hebrew teacher at Oberlin College and tutored Joseph Smith. In fact, we have a copy of his diploma declaring Smith proficient in biblical Hebrew. So Smith really sat down and went through this workbook that Satius had developed for kids at Oberlin and completed this course of study. In Times and Seasons, which I mentioned earlier, Smith cites none other than Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch when describing the value of commandment and the obligations of the practice of religious law. We also find in the Book of Mormon interesting descriptions of the value of Jewish secrets and Jewish texts for understanding the divine word. So in the book of Nephi 13:20 through 25, there's a discussion of Gentiles going into exile and that they carry with them a book that, quote, proceeded from the mouth of a Jew. And this is concerning their covenant with God. And the text notes that, quote, these things go forth from the Jews in purity unto the Gentiles according to that which is in God. This is one of the examples of description of Jewish truths that are of value to Christians and are of value to Mormons, and that this was part of how God conveys his truth in the Book of Mormon is via Jewish texts. We also find this goal of sort of restoring the true gospel and the true message of God, which has been perverted by the church since then, where Jewish knowledge is described as important for the spread of this true message of the church. And that's not a unique move within the Mormon case. We find that differences over doctrine and practice in the history of Christianity have sometimes made recourse to the claim that Kabbalah conveys the real true message of God, conveys the true religion of Jesus Christ, and that therefore Kabbalah can be mined as a repository for Christian truths that Jews have conveyed to the world, even if they themselves don't understand them. And that was a standard way of imagining the way that Jews even conveyed the Hebrew Bible to the world, that they didn't understand its Christological meaning, meaning that they didn't understand its anticipation of the New Testament. And in some ways, they are blind readers of their own texts. If you look at almost any cathedral built in the Middle Ages in Europe, you'll see ecclesia and synagoga, so representing two queens representing the church and the synagogue, Christians and Jews. Synagoga is always blindfolded. And the reason why is because she is a blind reader of her own law. So there's nothing particularly radical or surprising about imagining that Jews could be regarded as conveyors of divine truths that are not the same as the ones that they themselves espouse. Some scholars have argued that Joseph Smith's doctrines bear really strong similarities to Hermeticism and other forms of occult Western esoteric tradition, as well as the version of some of those traditions in Freemasonry. And there's nothing particularly surprising about that. Smith had been a Freemason, and nearly every white man of a certain class in the United States at this period was a Freemason or knew someone who was a Freemason. Freemasonry was another very public, secret discourse. But I'm not certain, first of all, I wouldn't argue that other forms of esotericism weren't important to Joseph Smith, and in all likelihood they were. But I think that the role of Kabbalah is vastly underplayed and underappreciated in that explanation for some of Smith's ideas. It fits actually better with Smith's worldview to look to Kabbalah as a place that he might have turned to for his own prophetic mission, because Jews were already a site of esoteric or secret revelation. Also, the similarities between Kabbalah and the kinds of esoteric traditions or occult traditions that were common in the United States and that were part of the parlance of Freemasonry bear affinities to Kabbalah because they also read Kabbalistic texts. So even if we imagine that there was an exposure to these other occult traditions, the version of those occult traditions that he would have encountered probably were similar to Kabbalah because those authors were also reading Kabbalistic books. So now, how would he have had direct access to Kabbalistic books or descriptions of Kabbalah itself? And the answer is that it's not hard to find it all. Here's a few examples. In the History of Philosophy by William Enfield, published in 1791, is a place when it talks about the history of Judaism, and it says, quote, the Kabbalah, or mystical interpretation of the law, was brought over from Egypt to Palestine by Rabbi Shimon ben Shattach. And this was common in many of these encyclopedias at the time, encyclopedias that would be found in any common library in many homes, was the idea that Kabbalah, usually spelled C-A-B-B-A-L-A or C-A-B-A-L-A, that Kabbalah was an ancient mystery tradition that Jews adopted in Egypt and then brought to Palestine and incorporated into Judaism. And this is why Solomonic knowledge, which often, of course, is extolled in Freemasonry, was seen as a kind of Egyptian knowledge. And of course, let's not forget, the Book of Mormon was said to be written in Reformed Egyptian. So this Egyptian Jewish mystical nexus was something that was commonly described in many of these books. In the same History of Philosophy by Enfield, it talks about the Kabbalah some more and mentions Shimon Yochaides, or Shimon Bar Yochai, who wrote the book The Zohar, and notes the transfer of this knowledge then into Spain. He then notes another interesting example is in the Encyclopedia Americana, makes similar claims about the derivation of Jewish secret knowledge from Egypt. We also find in the History of Jews from the Destruction of the Temple to Modern Times by Hannah Adams, published in London in 1818, draws on some of these earlier descriptions of Jewish mysticism and describes a lot of things about Kabbalah, many of which I just sort of described for you, describes how Kabbalistic ideas work, also has an appendix on none other than Menashe ben Israel and his theory of the derivation of the Native Americans from the lost tribes of the Israelites. There are other mechanisms, though, for Smith to have access to Kabbalistic texts. There was a book based on a book by Peter Stalin. There was a man named John Allen who wrote a book called Modern Judaism in 1816. And it's funny that that book was based on this other book, which was in turn actually almost a plagiarism of a book written by Johann Andreas Eisenmenger in 1700 in Germany called Entdecktes Judentums, which means Judaism Uncovered. It was a deeply anti-Semitic book, but it was also incredibly well done. And Eisenmenger was a great Hebraist, and he translated an incredible number of texts into German, which was then translated into French and into English. And Eisenmeger's text, I think, is actually the origin of where all of these other books that were circulating in England and then in North America are describing Kabbalistic texts and translating substantial passages from them. Ironically, Eisenmenger, as much as he said he wrote this book to uncover the evil of the Jewish tradition, he became somewhat unintentionally one of the best sources for the Jewish tradition. And as even the great Gershom Scholem, who was mentioned earlier, sort of the founder of the study of Jewish mysticism in the academic world, notes, Eisenmenger was an excellent scholar. His translations are really good. And in many ways, he shared with the modern West many aspects of Jewish texts, especially Jewish mysticism, that hadn't been as accessible before. So now, when we look at the ways in which this interest in Jewish literature circulates, we find that in 1842, a friend and convert named Alexander Niebuhr was a friend of Joseph Smith's, and he was a Jew who had studied Judaism, was pretty knowledgeable, had converted to Christianity and then converted to Mormonism in England, and then came to Nauvoo and also served as Smith's ongoing tutor and reader in Hebrew and in German, and reader of Jewish texts with him. And it's not long after that that we find Niebuhr published a two-part essay in the Mormon publication Times and Seasons in Nauvoo, in which he talks about the Jewish idea of the resurrection of the dead. And he says he provides this for, quote, those who have an interest in Jewish literature. Reading Jewish texts as a source of interesting truth for Mormons and for Christians was not something that was considered at all heretical or controversial in this time. But the place where I think we find the most interesting echo of the Jewish tradition is in a very central location in Smith's description of his own sort of most mature argument for his theology. And it's in the King Follett Discourse on April 7th, 1844, not long before Smith's own death, in which he describes the nature of God, his own notion of anthropomorphism, and of apotheosis, or the capacity for humans to become, in a sense, divine. He says, quote, God who sits in yonder heavens, this is based on one of the transcriptions of this text from people who were there. There are multiple transcriptions, again, all meticulously preserved on LDS website. He says, God who sits in yonder heavens is a man like yourselves. That God, if you were to see him today, that holds the worlds, you would see him like a man in form like yourselves. I want you to know the first principle of this law, how consoling to the mourner when they part with a friend, to know that they lay down this body and it will rise and dwell with everlasting burnings, to be an heir of God and joint with Jesus Christ, enjoying the same rise, exaltation, and glory until you arrive at the station of a God. If I should say anything but what was in the Bible, the cry of treason would be heard. I will then go to the Bible. Bereshit, in the beginning. Bereshit is a Hebrew word. Analyze the word. In and through the head. An old Jew added the word, or letter, bet. It read, the head one of the gods brought forth the gods. It's the end of Smith's comment there. So this is actually incredibly similar to one of the most famous passages from the Zohar in Zohar Mantua edition 15a, but similar to many other passages in the Kabbalistic text that describe creation, in which they say the word Bereshit bara, the words Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, God created et hashemayim v'et haaretz, the heavens and the earth. They say what that means is with or by means of Reshit, beginning, he created an entity called Elohim, or God. So by means of Reshit, he created Elohim. And so by means of beginning, he created God, or the gods. The word Elohim is a plural word. And what the Kabbalists take that to mean is that the first Sphira, Keter, meaning crown, together with Ein Sof, uses the second Sphira, which they label as the word Reshit, or beginning, to create the third Sphira, Binah, in the creation of the 10 Sphirot. And that there's a secret code to reading the beginning of Genesis to mean it's about the emergence of the 10 Sphirot, and that God uses them to create other ones, that with or by means of Reshit, he creates these other Sphirot. Now, already within Judaism, this is describing a kind of plurality within the divine realm. And Kabbalists were unafraid of that. They really were very comfortable talking about God in this way. What we find happening in Joseph Smith's version of it is that he said it should really read Reshit, beginning, created Elohim, the gods. So the first God created the gods, and that this is about the divinity, the sort of human-like divinity of God, and the creation of humans as a kind, or at least potentially becoming gods as well. So it's similar but different, right? And that's what we would expect. It's reasonable to assume that through a kind of process of internal prophetic revelation or refinement, Smith was able to expose this famous Kabbalistic text, or through exposure to it, was able to render it in his own really unique way. But Smith says, and it's worth noting in the King Follett Discourse, he says he would be happy to use other sources for describing this particular theological point. But he knows that people will cry treason if he uses anything but the Bible, so he'll use the Bible. I think we can take that to mean that he was comfortable using other sources. But he knows that many of his listeners wouldn't be, or at least the critics of Mormonism, maybe not the people there that day, but the people that would hear it in the future. And so he sticks with the Bible, even though he doesn't think that that's the only necessary source that one can use. We find numerous other passages in the Book of Mormon, in Doctrines and Covenants, when Smith refers to God as the endless, Ein Sof. This was a term that was, again, easily located in the texts that I mentioned. This was a notion, if you read about Judaism in something like Allen's Modern Judaism, they use the word modern Judaism to refer to all forms of Judaism after the destruction of the temple. So modern Judaism refers to everything from the Talmud through the Middle Ages and up to the 19th century. There's also a lot of interest in the theurgic principle, or the notion of human actions impacting the divine realm, because humans have this divine pre-existent soul with the power through priesthood to impact the divine realm and the human realm. So in the Book of Mormon, in Helaman 10:7, but it's also articulated in Doctrines and Covenants 132, it says, quote, "Then they shall be gods, because they have no end. Therefore shall they be from everlasting to everlasting, because they continue. Then shall they be above all, because all things are subject unto them. Then shall they be gods, because they have all power, and the angels are subject to them." And it continues on verse 46, saying, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, that whatsoever you sealeth on earth shall be sealed in heaven. And whatsoever you bind on earth, in my name and by my word, saith the Lord, it shall eternally be bound in the heavens. And whatsoever sins you remit on earth shall be remitted eternally in the heavens. And whatsoever sins you retain on earth shall be retained in heaven." So again, this notion of human actions impacting the divine realm, this theurgic conception of religious practice. This is something that isn't obvious in many Protestant traditions, but its resonance with Kabbalah is profound. It's also worth noting that the idea of the continuous connection between the divine and the spiritual with the material is described, according to Smith, in Doctrines and Covenants 88:41, where he says, And he is above all things, referring to God, and in all things, and is through all things, and is round about all things, and all things are by him and of him, even God forever and ever. So now it's possible that this idea could be connected to Jewish mystical texts simply because his exposure to them in English was not something that would have been hard for him to come across. But the number of Kabbalistic ideas that emerge over the course of the Book of Mormon and other writings by Smith is really remarkable. There's also a description, for instance, the three levels of the world in Mormonism, or of the afterlife that we mentioned, the celestial, terrestrial, and telestial. It's interesting that this is described by Neubauer in his article in Doctrines and Covenants, but it's very interesting to note that in Traditions of the Jews by Stalin, the very end of the book cites a passage from the Talmud, from Tractate Rosh Hashanah, in which it notes that when people pass away, they're divided into three camps. Those who are wicked and have to be punished for some period of time, the middling, who will be temporarily punished and then admitted to the world to come, and the righteous, who immediately enter the world to come. So to sum up, I think it's important to note that in a context in which Smith regards himself as restoring a lost religious doctrine, the true revelation from the divine, that it bears a lot of similarities to Jewish mysticism or Kabbalah, which itself claims to be a restored lost doctrine, revealed by God, secretly conveyed by Jews from Mount Sinai, and passed on to later generations. It would be hard to imagine that in that context, Smith, like other important religious thinkers of his day, wouldn't turn to Kabbalistic sources as a place of inspiration. And in fact, the very public face that Kabbalah enjoyed during this time tells us a lot about why we find Kabbalah turning up in so many different places. And again, that started in the Renaissance. Of course, we have the famous example of Pico della Mirandola, who used Kabbalah for his development of Renaissance humanism. But this was something we find with other philosophers, scientists. Isaac Newton took a tremendous interest in Kabbalah. The problem we have when thinking about the history of Kabbalah is we are perhaps deceived by Kabbalah's claims about itself, that it was a secret. We know the best way to popularize a secret idea is to claim that it's a secret in order for it to have its own public life. Thank you very much.
Hello? 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 All right, wait 1 second. Wait 1 second for me. Hold on, I just got to do something. Hold on. Come on. Hold on, I just got to post something. Hello? Okay. All right, let's do a little bit more reading. Yeah, let's do a little bit more reading. So hold on 1 second. Okay. The 18th century was a fertile breeding ground for occult societies, almost all of which had grounds in a Hermetic Kabbalistic framework and upon a bedrock of Masonry and Rosicrucianism. Students unfamiliar with their history too commonly assume a consistency and cohesion in these movements or confound them with the charitable fraternities that are their distant modern cousins. On the contrary, a creative heterogeneity and religious making mysticism was rampant among these groups. Existing orders and lodges were not commonly transmuted by the force of strange individuals, new visions, and claims of ever more enlightened ancient origins. Examples come easily. Adam Weishaupt, who sought through his Masonic order of the Illuminati, founded in 1776 to transform German politics and society. The mysterious Comte de Saint Germain, around 1710 to 1785, a devotee of alchemy and occult arts who widely influenced continental lodges of masonry. Count Alessandro di Cagliostro, who blended Egyptian and Kabbalistic mysticism into his Egyptian Masonic rite, an order which included men, women, and rumors of ritual sexual liaison. Martinez de Pasquale and his order of Les Elus Cohen, the elect priests, claiming a Kabbalistic Masonic restoration of the ancient priesthood of Judaism, a notion echoed in other esoteric manifestations of Masonry. And Louis Claude de Saint Martin, disciple of de Pasquale, who long remained an influence over French occultism. To these must be added the brilliant Swedish Sir Emanuel Swedenborg, founder of a religious movement that touched esoteric masonry. Though several Though several visionary figures stood in this rank of illuminates, eventually the broader manifestation of the movement attracted more than a few opportunistic charlatans. Separating the two is not easy for historians today than it was for their contemporaries. In summary, common threads of specific mythos were through these movements and societies, even if they are not of one common cloth. The occult inclination of the 17th and 18th centuries, one finds a recurrent theme of restoration of a more perfect and ancient order, of forgotten priesthood, of secret mysteries and rituals, and of lost occult words and powers. There mingles in the visionary fabric a occult world and powers. Often there mingles in the visionary fabric a practical thread. Man is intrinsically and eternally imbued with uncreated divine intelligence, an elixir by which the man alchemically transmutes the dark metal world, including its social and political structures, and dark material world, including its social and political structures, and thus restores Zion upon the earth. It was an opus reflected thus res- uh, in allegories, glyphs, and symbols by a canon reopened and reinterpreted, and in ancient lost books again found, buried, hidden, golden treasures, all awaiting men and women who would delve. For seers of this age, the task at hand were personal, but by nature the inner opus was reflected outwardly. Microcosmos and macrocosmos were inextricably linked. This broad world view engendered laborers in an ancient craft, builders of a new temple, a mystical structure ordered above and below by living links of light and vision. And in the Holy of Holies of the sanctum, they sought a sacred wedding of transformation union, a mysterium conjunction something. It was in some wedding of transformation union, it was in some a hermetic Kabbalistic mythos, deeply admixed with alchemy and reformed by Rosicrucianism, and conjoined with the Mason's compass and square, and at its esoteric core there shone a distant Gnostic spark. Okay, all this junk that they were into. Hermetic and magical worldview. A decade ago, Mormon historians were forced to confront the subject of Joseph Smith and the occult or magic worldview, a confrontation caused in part by the discovery of the so-called Salamander letter, replete with references to seer stones, treasures, and enchantments. The letter also related that Joseph Smith obtained the Book of Mormon not from an angel, but from a magical white salamander, which transfigured itself into a spirit. Though the letter was subsequently proved a forgery, for 2 years historians labored under the assumption that the letter and several companion forgers were genuine. In the wake of these events, the prophet Joseph Smith's spiritual roots came under a careful scrutiny. Ironically, investigators soon brought to the surface a wealth of unquestionably genuine material, much of its long available but much of it's long available but either misunderstood or ignored, substantiating that Smith and wait. Ironically, investigators soon brought to the surface a wealth of unquestionably genuine material, much of it long available but either misunderstood or ignored, substantiating that Smith and his family had a variety of interactions with non-Orthodox Western religious traditions generally termed occult. Repercussions from this difficult period in Mormon studies are still playing out. Cast into the realm of occult history, historians try to make sense of the occult Joseph Smith and early Mormonism. The general interpretations eventually adopted by many investigators introduce Joseph Smith's link to the occult with this sociological context of New England folk magic and its magic worldview by Dr. Michael Quinn's seminal study Early Mormonism in the Magic Worldview was initiated during the period in his introduction. Quinn began to exercise the forgeries and summoning the facts. The historical issue these forgeries raised require, I believe, a careful reevaluation of evidence long in existence regarding early Mormonism and magic. Sources whose authenticity are beyond question provide evidence of Joseph Smith's participation in treasure digging, the possession and use of instruments and emblems of folk magic by Smith, his family members, and other early LDS leaders, the continued use of such implements for religious purposes in the establishment of early years of Mormonism, and the sincere belief of many early Mormons in the magic worldview. Subsequently, Quinn moved beyond these simple data. Indeed, this subsequently couldn't move beyond this simple data. Indeed, comprehensive is hardly is an adequate description of this survey. Magic rituals, Kabbalah, Hermes Trismegistus, Rosicrucians, seer stones, divine rods, Masonic lore, and astrology. Quinn binds them all by evidencing all by evidence weak and strong to Joseph. Less integrative than extensive, his study is a foundation of works which, as any such work should, leaves far more questions unresolved than answered. The subject broached by this effort demands further evaluation. A crucial correction, however, must be made to the methodology used in examining the data. The concept of magic or worldview, the magic Weltanschauung or worldview must be balanced with an intensive historical casting of early 19th century occultism's lineage and mythos. Particularly important is a careful examination of Hermeticism and the nature of the religious vision encouraged. Faced with a vast subject, Quinn constructed an arena for his study by circumscribing the concept of a magic worldview with the culture of early America and then summoning the various facts that drew Joseph Smith and other early Mormons into that circle. The definition of magic came from Webster's Third International Dictionary, augmented and slightly expanded. Magic is, and not to quote the whole definition given by Quinn, I will abbreviate, the use of means that are believed to have supernatural power to cause supernatural beings to produce or prevent a particular result. The control of natural forces by the typical direct action of rites, object, materials, or words considered spiritually powerful. Later, Quinn adds that magic tends to incorporate an animistic worldview and a sense of chain of causation behind events. Though it can be supplicative, its intent is often coercive. One is ill-advised to argue here with Quinn's general approach of definition of magic and its worldview. Given the many constraints upon such a path-breaking investigation, both are well enough chosen. Nonetheless, their static sociological and philological correctness partially obscure a more complex process at play. Magic came in many forms, high and low, as discussed earlier in Europe. The medieval legacy of magic was transformed between the 15th and 17th century by an influx of highly defined Kabbalistic, Hermetic, and alchemical traditions. During that time, magic became, at least for scholarly adherents like Pico de Meridolo, Giordano Bruno, and John Dee, something akin to religion. In the Hermetic Kabbalistic interpretation, magic had more to do with obtaining experiential knowledge of God and the celestial hierarchies than with particularistic goal of control and coercion. The digging for vulgar gold. Both Jewish and Christian practitioners of the high magical arts would have judged Webster's definition as applicable more to a reprehensible form of popular or folk magic than to their own pursuits. By the 17th century, the Hermetic magic had become thoroughly intertwined with a wider reformative religious vision and a coherent foundation of mythos. This view asserted the human potential for divine communication, progression to ultimate knowledge, and even union or identity with God. Okay. Okay, let's keep listening. Oh no, hello? Okay, actually we're going to the new documentary now. So um Oh, yeah, if you wanna, my website, bewiseserpent.blogspot.com has all these documentaries on it and all the books and papers that I'm reading. It's all here. So now we're gonna listen to Occult Context of Joseph Smith's 1823 discovery of the gold plates.
I'll put this steak on there. Yeah, steak's delicious. And I'm so far very impressed with it. And
on the 27th of April, 1838, shortly after his arrival at far west Caldwell County, Missouri, Joseph Smith, with Counselor Sidney Rigdon and Clerk George W. Robinson, began dictating what would become the official history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. By the 2nd of May, this first draft of Joseph Smith's history, which is apparently no longer extant, had reached the account of Smith's obtaining the gold plates in September 1827. On this day, Smith dictated a passage that James Mulholland carried over unchanged into the final draft in 1839. I delivered the plates up to the angel, and he has them in his charge until this day, being the 2nd day of May, 1838. Smith's history did not progress much further than this, for there is no record of his working on his history in Missouri after the 4th of May. Any hope of returning to the project while in Missouri was permanently dashed when Governor Lilburn W. Boggs issued his infamous extermination order and imprisoned Joseph Smith and other church leaders in December 1838. After Smith's escape, the project was resumed in Commerce, later named Nauvoo, Illinois, on the 11th of June 1839, with James Mulholland as scribe. Between this date and Mulholland's death on the 3rd of November, a draft of 25 pages was produced. This draft begins abruptly with the baptisms of Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery in May 1829 and ends with the events of September 1830. About July or August 1839, Mulholland began copying the Robinson draft and then his draft with some editing into Book A1 of the manuscript history, and managed to record 59 pages prior to his death. After becoming editor-in-chief of the Mormon periodical Times and Seasons, Joseph Smith published the first installment of his history in the 15th of March 1842 issue. In the next 3 issues, 1st of April, 15th of April, and 2nd of May 1842, he published the story of his 1823 encounter with the angel and discovery of the gold plates. This official version carefully stripped out elements of the original story that were tied to his previous occupation as a treasure seer or scryer. The purpose of this video will be to reconstruct the original story and restore it to its folk, magic, and treasure-seeking context, a part of the story the average Mormon is woefully unaware. But first, the official version, as it was published in the Times and Seasons. Following the account of his 1820 vision of deity, Joseph Smith said he fell into diverse temptations to the gratification of many appetites offensive in the sight of God, and that on the evening of the 21st of September, 1823, after I had retired to my bed for the night, I betook myself to prayer and supplication to Almighty God for forgiveness of all my sins and follies. While I was thus in the act of calling upon God, I discovered a light appearing in the room, which continued to increase until the room was lighter than at noonday, when immediately a personage appeared at my bedside, standing in the air, for his feet did not touch the floor. He had a loose robe of most exquisite whiteness. It was a whiteness beyond anything earthly I had ever seen, nor do I believe that any earthly thing could be made to appear so exceedingly white and brilliant. His hands were naked, and his arms also a little above the wrist. So also were his feet naked, as were his legs a little above the ankles. His head and neck were also bare. I could discover that he had no other clothing on but this robe, as it was open, so that I could see into his bosom. Not only was his robe exceedingly white, but his whole person was glorious beyond description, and his countenance truly like lightning. The room was exceedingly light, but not so very bright as immediately around his person. When I first looked upon him, I was afraid, but the fear soon left me. He called me by name and said unto me that he was a messenger sent from the presence of God to me, and that his name was Nephi. I interrupt my narrative to mention that Nephi was corrected to Moroni in Book A1 by church historian Albert Carrington, probably in 1871, to make it consistent with other contemporary sources. Continuing, Smith states that God had a work for me to do, and that my name should be had for good and evil among all nations, kindreds, and tongues, or that it should be both good and evil spoken of among all people. He said there was a book deposited, written upon gold plates, giving an account of the former inhabitants of this continent, and the source from whence they sprang. He also said that the fullness of the everlasting gospel was contained in it, as delivered by the Savior to the ancient inhabitants. Also that there were 2 stones and silver bows, and these stones fastened to a breastplate constituted what is called the Urim and Thummim, deposited with the plates, and the possession and use of these stones was what constituted seers in ancient or former times, and that God had prepared them for the purpose of translating the book. I pause once again to note that the Urim and Thummim, meaning in Hebrew light and perfection, is an allusion to divining stones that were part of Aaron's breastplate. While there was no attempt to claim the instrument buried with the plates was the same one used by Jewish high priests before the captivity, as used here, its purpose was to obscure the folk magic connection with seer stones by linking it to the Old Testament. However, the term as applied to Joseph Smith's magic spectacles was not introduced into Mormon thought until about 1832, and so it is an anachronism. In fact, the idea that a translating instrument would be buried with the plates wasn't even Smith's idea, but was suggested by fellow seer Samuel Lawrence in 1825. More on this later. Continuing with Smith's 1838 account. After telling me these things, he commenced quoting the prophecies of the Old Testament. He first quoted part of the 3rd chapter of Malachi, and he quoted also the 4th or last chapter of the same prophecy, though with a little variation from the way it reads in our Bibles. He quoted the 5th verse thus, "Behold, I will reveal unto you the priesthood by the hand of Elijah the prophet, before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord." I pause again to note that the concept that Elijah would reveal the priesthood was absent from Mormon thought until 1836, when Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery claimed Elijah and other heavenly messengers appeared and bestowed various keys upon them in the Kirtland Temple. Oliver Cowdery's 1834-35 history quoted the angel's words and prophecies about the gathering of Israel in the last days at great length, but not one word about priesthood or Elijah. Regardless, this was not part of the earliest recitals of the 1823 vision, but is another anachronism. Continuing with Joseph Smith's 1838 account, again he told me that when I got those plates of which he had spoken, for the time that they should be obtained was not yet fulfilled, I should not show them to any person, neither the breastplate with the Urim and Thummim, only to those to whom I should be commanded to show them. If I did, I should be destroyed. While he was conversing with me about the plates, the vision was opened to my mind that I could see the place where the plates were deposited, and that so clearly and distinctly that I knew the place again when I visited it. Note the similarity to Joseph Smith's 1825 demonstration for Josiah Stoll, when he looked into a seer stone and then described Stoll's home and farm 130 miles away in South Bainbridge, which Stoll testified to at Smith's 1826 trial. Smith continues his narrative. After this communication, I saw the light in the room begin to gather immediately around the person of him who had been speaking to me, and it continued to do so until the room was again left dark, except just around him, when instantly I saw as it were a conduit open right up into heaven, and he ascended up till he entirely disappeared, and the room was left as it had been before this heavenly light had made its appearance. According to Smith's account, the same messenger appeared 2 more times, and repeated the very same things which he had done at his first visit, without the least variation. As we will see, this thrice repeated message had magical significance. On the last visit, the messenger added a caution to me, telling me that Satan would try to tempt me in consequence of the indigent circumstances of my father's family, to get the plates for the purpose of getting rich. This he forbid me, saying that I must have no other object in view in getting the plates but to glorify God, and must not be influenced by any other motive but that of building the kingdom. Otherwise, I could not get them. I shortly after arose from my bed, and as usual went to the necessary labors of the day. But in attempting to labor, as at other times, I found my strength so exhausted as rendered me entirely unable. My father, who was laboring along with me, discovered something to be wrong with me, and told me to go home. I started with the intention of going to the house, but in attempting to cross the fence out of the field where we were, my strength entirely failed me, and I fell helpless on the ground, and for a time was quite unconscious of anything. The first thing that I can recollect was a voice speaking unto me, calling me by name. I looked up and beheld the same messenger standing over my head, surrounded by light as before. He then again related to me all that he had related to me the previous night, and commanded me to go to my father and tell him the vision and commandments which I had received. I obeyed. I returned back to my father in the field, and rehearsed the whole matter to him. He replied to me that it was of God, and to go and do as commanded by the messenger. I left the field and went to the place where the messenger had told me the plates were deposited, and owing to the distinctness of the vision which I had had concerning it, I knew the place the instant that I arrived there. Convenient to the village of Manchester, Ontario County, New York, stands a hill of considerable size, and the most elevated of any in the neighborhood. On the west side of this hill, not far from the top, under a stone of considerable size, lay the plates, deposited in a stone box. This stone was thick and rounding in the middle on the upper side, and thinner towards the edges, so that the middle part of it was visible above the ground, but the edge all around was covered with earth. Having removed the earth and obtained a lever, which I got fixed under the edge of the stone, and with a little exertion raised it up. I looked in, and there indeed did I behold the plates, the Urim and Thummim, and the breastplate, as stated by the messenger. The box in which they lay was formed by laying stones together in some kind of cement. In the bottom of the box were laid 2 stones crossways of the box, and on these stones lay the plates, and the other things with them. I made an attempt to take them out, but was forbidden by the messenger, and was again informed that the time for bringing them forth had not yet arrived, neither would until 4 years from that time. But he told me that I should come to that place precisely in 1 year from that time, and that he would there meet with me, and that I should continue to do so until the time should come for obtaining the plates. Accordingly, as I had been commanded, I went at the end of each year, and at each time I found the same messenger there, and received instruction and intelligence from him at each of our interviews respecting what the Lord was going to do, and how and in what manner his kingdom was to be conducted in the last days. This is where Joseph Smith's narration ends. He next discusses his employment with Josiah Stowell as a money digger, beginning in October 1825, without mentioning his use of a seer stone or his subsequent trial in South Bainbridge in March 1826 as a disorderly person for pretending to find lost objects through said stone. After mentioning his marriage to Emma Hale in January 1827, he narrates the story of his removal of the plates from the hill in Manchester in September 1827, which will be discussed in another video. Contrary to his promise to put all inquirers after truth into possession of the facts, Smith was less than forthcoming when he misrepresented his involvement in money digging as a one-time event in 1825 as one of Josiah Stowell's hired hands. In fact, however, he was a leader in many such operations over a period of at least 3 years, locating the places to dig with his seer stone. Non-Mormon historian Alan Taylor, who charitably referred to Smith's prevarication as a de-emphasis, suggested that Smith recognized that a reputation for treasure-seeking was a handicap in communicating his message to an audience increasingly committed to rationality and a more abstract understanding of religion. Jan Ships was also charitable when she said, "It seems reasonable to conclude that the motive for playing down this part of the prophet's background was the knowledge that it could be used as the basis for charges that might endanger his reputation." Actually, Joseph Smith was doing more than preserving his reputation. He was overhauling his history and reinventing himself to become a more suitable leader for his followers and potential followers. If Smith was to consolidate and expand his authority and influence, his story would have to lose its cultural particularity and become more universal. Thus, it is also quite apparent, as D. Michael Quinn and others have demonstrated, that Joseph Smith de-emphasized the folk magic and treasure-seeking context of his 1823 and 1827 encounters with Moroni, and inserted anachronistic elements such as the terms angel and the Urim and Thummim, and the reference to Elijah returning to reveal the priesthood, all of which gave it a more mainstream Christian flavoring. I shall therefore strip away these anachronisms and search for the earliest version of the story, one that appealed to his treasure-seeking father and friends. In fact, the story Smith told was so believable that his fellow treasure-seeking companions made repeated attempts to find the plates and other treasures in the hill, although later, after Joseph's story became more fully developed, they rejected it as a hoax. First off, the night of the 21st of September, 1823, was significant for treasure seekers, as believing historian D. Michael Quinn has noted. Smith's prayer on 21 September 1823 occurred once the moon reached its maximum fullness the previous day, and just before the autumnal equinox. The full moon was the preferred time for treasure digging. Quinn, also notes, Smith began praying late Sunday night on the 21st of September 1823, as he claimed, to commune with some kind of messenger. Astrological guides specified that Sunday night was the only night of the week ruled by Jupiter. Jupiter, Smith's ruling planet, was the most prominent astrological symbol on his family's golden layman, or holiness to the Lord parchment, for summoning a good spirit. Earlier that evening, according to what Martin Harris later told Palmyra minister John A. Clark in the fall of 1827, Joseph had acted as a seer for a local treasure-seeking expedition. Consequently, long before the idea of a golden Bible entered their minds, in their excursions for money digging, which I believe usually occurred in the night, that they might conceal from others the knowledge of the place where they struck upon treasures, Joe used to be usually their guide, putting into a hat a peculiar stone he had, through which he looked to decide where they should begin to dig. According to Martin Harris, it was after one of these night excursions that Joe, while he lay upon his bed, had a remarkable dream. In her history, Lucy Smith did not mention the digging that occurred on the astrologically significant night. Instead, she related that her family stayed up late into the evening, conversing upon the subject of the diversity of churches that had risen up in the world, and the many thousand opinions in existence as to the truths contained in Scripture. Not an unlikely topic for a late Sunday night conversation. But Lucy probably minimizes the intensity of this discussion, since young Joseph's reaction was more extreme than on any previous occasion. Lucy noticed that
Hello? Hello? Oh god. Hello? Hello, 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 hello. Hello? There we go. Okay. Just getting my coffee and we're gonna continue reading. Been looking up some interesting stuff. The Stan Vogel guy is very interesting. He thinks that the Book of Mormon is anti-Mason. He gave me some interesting things that I want to start investigating. I found another video of him on Mormonism and anti-Masonry, and also I found I don't think I can get it because it's paid. I have to pay for it, but a paper he wrote on Mormonism and anti-Masonry. I'm interested now. I'm very interested because he said in one the and the this was the first video we did on Mormonism. If you want to see the first anti-Mormon, the first anti-Masonry and Mormonism video, see the first part 1, Mormonism and Judeo-Freemasonry, on my vincentbrunoblogspot.com, and um you'll find it there. It's also on bewiseserpents.blogspot.com. It's also on bewiseserpents.blogspot.com. Okay. But I'm interested because he says the Book of Mormon is anti-Mason and basically tries to predict the coming of like an evil Freemason empire taking over the earth, which is interesting. Um, I'm interested in using Freemasonry, using Mormonism to spread Noahidism. But if it can be used to fight Noahidism, I don't think it can be used to fight Noahidism. I think the Mormon Church is lock, stock, barrel, Freemason, Noahide controlled, Jew controlled, Zionist controlled. I have a paper on Mormonism and Zionism that we're going to be reading next. And yes. Okay. Certainly, popular magic, with its less refined concerns, continued to exist, and in terms of pure numbers of practitioners, it most likely dominated in the common culture. But British historian Keith Thomas notes the important distinction that must be developed between popular magic and the separate intellectual or enlisted trends. Speaking here of developments of the 17th and early 18th centuries, notes, it would thus be tempting to explain the practice of popular magic as the reflection of the alchemical and hermetic intellectual interests of contemporary scientists and philosophers, but such a chain of reasoning would almost certainly be mistaken. By this period, popular magic and intellectual magic were essentially two different activities overlapping at certain points, but to a large extent carried on in virtual independence of each other. What Thomas calls intellectual magic was, of course, the 17th century mix of Hermeticism, Kabbalah, and alchemy. The point I am making is that magic could be more and less than magic, whatever terms one may use to define the noun. From the 16th century into the early 19th century, it had at least two different historical manifestations, in each with different aspirations and lineages. Popular or folk magic with its magic worldview was undoubtedly common in early 19th century America, but there had also entered into the matrix of American religion elements of this other intellectual hermetic mythos, and its worldview was much more complex. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Hermetic tradition had developed sub rosa several elements characteristic of an incipient heterodox religion, including clear restoration aspirations. From the fertile bed sprang numerous occult fraternities and societies, Kabbalistic, alchemical, magical, and Masonic. And though they generally used a Christian vocabulary, the intentions they fostered could appear antithetical to Orthodox Christianity. Most importantly, it was a view of man and God intrinsically hostile to door Puritan presumptions. Classic Protestants thought accepted no theology, genesis, or genealogy of God, and in Orthodox judgment, new divine revelation was, as Marek Cosbon expressed, nothing else but imposture or melancholy and depraved fantasies arising from natural causes. By contrast, in the Hermetic tradition, these emerges are a coherent and radically alternative vision, which, as Jocelyn Godwin explains, combines the practical examination of nature with a spiritual view of the universal universe as an intelligent hierarchy of beings which draws it down from all possible sources and which sees the proper end of man as the direct knowledge of God. This kind of belief underlies the Rosicrucian manifestos. It is presumed in Robert Flood's work and in those of the alchemists. It reappears in the most esoteric aspects of Freemasonry. By the late 18th century, elements usually associated with the formation of a new religion were presented in this alternative tradition. An intricate and extensive mythic framework derived from Kabbalistic, Hermetic, alchemical, and Rosicrucian materials, an extra-canonical corpus of sacred texts drawn from archaic Hebrew and Hermetic sources, a new symbol system conveying esoteric meaning, detailed initiatory and ritual formulas, a claim to lineage of ancient priesthood, and an affirmation of renewed confirmation with with these celestial realms, and a thoroughly articulate, reformative, even millennial aspiration for new academic restoration. When I speak of the Hermetic or Hermetic Kabbalistic tradition in the early 19th century, I mean this amalgamation of elements along with the underpinning Hermetic mythos. Though any backwoods rodsman divining for burial treasure, though any backswood rodsman diving for buried treasure in New York in 1820 may have known about the tradition, it would be erroneous to lump him into it or to see it necessarily reflected in him. Yet here the distinction must be drawn. In the same general time and place, there undoubtedly existed individuals who were deeply cognizant of Hermeticism, its lore, ritual, and aspirations, and the group probably included an occasional association of treasure diggers. Such individuals would have learned about the Hermetic tradition in varying degrees and from various lineages, including esoteric Masonic and Rosicrucian orders, but most certainly not as transmission of popular magic and folklore alone. In summary, the treasures diggers the treasure digger's magic worldview, the supernatural method to means must be distinguished from the more complex Hermetic vision conveyed in the mix of Kabbalah, ceremonial magic, Paracelsian medicine, Rosicrucianism, alchemical symbolism, and several esoteric brands of masonry. And what a young Joseph Smith could have learned from a Rodsman ensconced only in a magic worldview is less important to his religious development than the kinds of ideas as Hermetic initiate might have stimulated. Joseph Smith, Hermeticism and Kabbalah. In the period 1827, Joseph Smith probably had some passing interaction with individual knowledge of Hermeticism and Kabbalah, but to reconstruct the history of that exposure demands consideration of extent and hypotheses tied to a thin heritage of fact. It is a type of connection that appears likely but which cannot be documented with certainty. The situation changes a bit after 1840. During those last years of Joseph's life, evidence linked him to the Hermetic Kabbalistic tradition can, when placed in context, appear substantial. In the following discussion, I will sketch some of the more evidences linking Joseph to the Hermetic tradition, both early in his prophetic career and later in Nauvoo. And though the standing of fact may seem too light or dark, or in proportion skewed, this is a way of drawing Joseph Smith within his own history that I believe must be confronted by Mormon historians. Of course, a question arises that lineages lingers as a subtext to the material that follows and must be addressed before proceeding. If Joseph Smith had significant interactions with the Hermetic Kabbalistic mythos, did they impact his religious making vision? While it seems to me that they probably would or did, I also acknowledge another possibility. Despite any apparent historical interactions, common patterns connecting Smith's vision to the Hermetic Kabbalistic mythos may be entirely synchronous or parallel rather than casual. And if synchronous, they further could be classed as archetypical manifestations consistent with recurrent types of revelationary experience, such as is witnessed elsewhere in the history of the traditions, or instead as pure happenstance. And if one is inclined to look for links, deeper levels of complexity soon intrude. The Hermetic Kabbalistic tradition not only affirmed the existence of an archetypical structural accessible to independent personal cognition or revelation, it sought through combined modalities of ritual, symbol, and myth to aid an individual's encounter with his own core reality, a reality mirrored in the celestial realm and in the seeker's own self. Accepting that some individuals obtain these experiences, the question of casual versus synchronous links becomes circular. One can argue that contact with various Hermetic ideas, symbols, ceremonies, and myths could, at least occasionally and improperly, and the properly predisposed individual help involve a numinous and uniquely individual experience. The experience, though personal and self-contained, might become the substratum for creative development of further institution and insights inherently present in the inditing mythos. Thus, a tradition breeds an experience which then replicates anew the tradition. This whole issue recalls the question plaguing historical traditions of Gnosticism and its various manifestations. Is the tradition conveyed through historical identification transmissions, are a various historical manifestations of Gnostic vision, instead of creations of a reborn and independent gnosis imbued with similar core insights, what depth psychology calls archetypical patterns, or are both modes of transmission, inner and outer, intrinsically coupled? To these questions I can give no answer. I offer only my intuition that they lurk behind any interpretation of evidence links Joseph Smith to Hermeticism. D. Michael Quinn extensively details extensive evidence of Joseph's early contact with Hermeticism, though he emphasizes the folk magical aspect. He offers the Smiths family careful preserved magical parchments and daggers, and talismans Joseph carried on his person. One recognizes the prominent use of Hebrew on both the parchment and talisman, although the reason for this has not been put in clear context by Mormon historians. The Hebrew came from Kabbalah. As Quinn documents knowledge necessary for the preparation of the Smith family magical implements could have been obtained from books of magic available in this time and region, and such a material might have been acquired specifically to aid magical activities associated with treasure seeking, preparation for and proper performance of magical rituals, including production of ceremonial daggers or parchments, was, however, a lengthy and complicated venture demanding knowledge of an arcane vocabulary. The vast host of angels and spirits addressed in different magical rituals had a specific name, again drawn from Kabbalah, elaborate magical signs, and varied functions within the natural and celestial hierarchies. From this complexity, magic lore made it clear that there were defined existential dangers in getting the debate wrong. It thus seems likely that, in addition to information gleaned from books, family members would have arguments their knowledge, but would have augmented their knowledge by associations with individual experienced in ceremonial magic and the occult arts. In this company, Joseph Smith might have first been exposed to a person versed in the deep breath of Hermeticism. Okay, let's continue.
The 17-year-old Joseph seemed withdrawn, as if in deep contemplation. He was quiet, but not unaffected. Whatever he may have felt about his part in the treasure hunt, it was undoubtedly his parents' religious turmoil that most stirred him, in the words of his mother, to reflect more deeply than common persons of his age upon everything of a religious nature. Joseph, more than any of his siblings, well understood the religious quandary in which his parents found themselves. There was much he could say, but in the swirl of emotional debate, who would hear him? Besides, he was just a youth, with little standing or authority in such matters. More than anything, Joseph's silence likely resulted from his ambivalent feelings and the high emotional price of choosing sides. Very little was resolved when the Smith family finally retired for the night. It was evidently a sleepless night for young Joseph, and the following day he would tell his family an incredible story. In Joseph's account, the angel simply commands him to tell his father. In Lucy's version, the messenger asked Joseph why he had not told his father about the plates, to which Joseph responded, "I was afraid my father would not believe me." But the messenger assured Joseph that his father would believe every word you say to him. Joseph's hesitancy to tell his father was likely due to the reception he received in telling his first vision experience of 1820, which he said in his 1832 history he could find none that would believe the heavenly vision. Nevertheless, I pondered these things in my heart. Joseph's one line of authority with his father was his gift of seeing and his father's belief in treasure lore about guardian spirits. When Joseph returned to his father and brother, he told them an amazing but not entirely unfamiliar story. In relating it, Joseph did not stray far from his father's belief in hidden treasures and guardian spirits. Unlike the vision of a wingless angel with long flowing robe that Smith would later narrate for an audience unreceptive to folk magic, the earliest accounts identify the heavenly messenger as a spirit who visited Joseph 3 times in a dream. About June 1829, Martin Harris, for instance, told people in Rochester that Joseph had been visited by the Spirit of the Almighty in a dream, and informed that in a certain hill was deposited a golden Bible, and that after a third visit from the same Spirit in a dream, he proceeded to the spot. Palmyra newspaperman Abner Cole reported in 1831 that Joseph Sr. described the spirit as a little old man with a long beard. reporting on the activities of the first Mormon missionaries in Ohio under the direction of Oliver Cowdery. The Painesville Telegraph for the 30th of November, 1830 said, "The new gospel, they say, was found in Ontario County, New York, and was discovered by an angel of light appearing in a dream to a man by the name of Smith. Locating treasures through dreams was not uncommon in Smith's day, and thrice repeated dreams were especially significant. In 1786, Silas Hamilton, a prominent leader of Whittingham, Vermont, recorded 21 instances of people from various locations throughout New England claiming to have located mines and other valuable deposits through dreams. In one instance, a Mr. Barnes of Guilford, New Hampshire, dreamed 3 times in one night about said hogshead of money. In her 1835 book, Traits of American Life, Sarah Josepha Hale published a late 18th century legend about a Deacon Bascom, one of the founders of Newport, New Hampshire. One night the deacon was visited 3 times in a dream by a man clothed in black, who told him where to find a silver mine under a large stone. When he proceeded to the spot and found the stone, he hesitated to uncover the treasure. After much anguish, he concluded that the dream was inspired by the devil and would bring ruin to his children, so he returned home. The legend of Deacon Bascom is typical of the treasure lore embedded in the folk consciousness of Smith's contemporaries. As it turns out, however, the Smith family not only inherited this rich tradition, but contributed to it as well. Former Manchester neighbor Orrin P. Rockwell, who like Smith walked with a limp, recalled in 1872 that his mother Sarah and Lucy Smith used to spend their Saturday evenings together telling their dreams and comparing notes and telling how such a one's dream and such another's pointed to the same lucky spot, how the spades often struck the iron sides of a treasure chest, and how it was charmed away, now 6 inches this side, now 4 feet deeper, and again completely out of reach. Joseph's story mirrored his father's dreams as well, which sometimes included spirit guides who instructed him about the location of a box or a beautiful garden. Following the rehearsal of his incredible story, Joseph Jr. remembered that his father wept and replied that it was of God and to go and do as commanded by the messenger. Lucy gave more detail, stating that his father charged him not to fail in attending strictly to the instruction which he had received from this heavenly messenger. Lucy's version, with its emphasis on following the treasure guardian's instructions precisely, captures more fulsomely the folk magic context of the story. Joseph said that he immediately left the field and went to the hill alone. This glacially formed drumlin had long since caught the attention of all who traveled the Canandaigua Road between the villages of Palmyra and Manchester. At the time of Smith's visit, the hill was forested except for its northern summit, which was covered with grass, rocks, and a few scattered trees. When he returned home later that evening, he related another incredible story, but still one that was familiar to the treasure seekers in his family. As soon as he entered the house, Lucy recalled that Joseph Sr. anxiously pressed his son, wanting to know if he had been successful in obtaining the plates. "No, father, I could not get them," Joseph answered. "Did you see them?" Joseph Sr. asked. "Yes," Joseph said, "I saw them, but could not take them." "I would have taken them if I had been in your place," Joseph Sr. replied. "Why, you do not know what you say," Joseph said. "I could not get them, for the angel of the Lord would not let me." As his family gathered around him, Joseph began to relate all that he had made known to his father in the field, as well as what had occurred on the hill earlier that day. Regarding Joseph's visit to the hill, Lucy remembered that Joseph told his family he climbed to the hill's summit, pried up a large stone, and discovered the gold plates encased in a stone box, just as the heavenly messenger had described. As he lifted the plates from the box, he wondered if there might be something else in the container that could bring some pecuniary advantage to him and his family, and wishing to protect the treasure, set the plates down behind him and replaced the cover stone. When he turned around to retrieve the plates, they had vanished. Surprised, Joseph asked why the plates had been taken from him. Instantly, the heavenly messenger appeared and explained that he had not been diligent in obeying his instructions. Joseph had faltered on 2 counts. He had allowed covetous thoughts to enter his mind. The messenger had said that the plates could not be brought forth with an eye to worldly gain, and he had received strict commandment not to lay the plates down or put them for a moment out of his hands until he got into the house and deposited them in a chest or trunk, having a good lock and key. Joseph was permitted to raise the large stone again and saw that the plates had miraculously returned to their original location. According to Lucy, he immediately reached forth his hand to take them, but instead of getting them, as he anticipated, he was hurled back upon the ground with great violence. After recovering, he discovered that the messenger had disappeared. Lucy Smith's 1845 account contains elements not mentioned by Joseph in 1838. The themes of following magic formulae precisely, being attacked by the treasure guardian spirit, and the miraculous movement of treasure were familiar to those steeped in treasure lore about cursed and enchanted treasures. As early as 1729, Benjamin Franklin and Joseph Brightnall described the prevalence of money digging, stating, "They wander through the woods and bushes by day to discover the marks and signs. At midnight, they repair to the hopeful spot. With spades and pickaxes, full of expectation, they labor violently, trembling at the same time in every joint, through fear of certain malicious demons who are said to haunt and guard such places." While digging for treasure in Rochester, New York, in 1814, it was claimed by one company that when the rule of silence was violated, the charm was broken, the scream of demons, the chattering of spirits, and hissing of serpents rent the air, and the treasure moved. This 1832 painting by John Quidor, called The Money Diggers, presently in the Brooklyn Museum, captures the moment of the guardian spirit's appearance. Based on Washington Irving's 1824 story, The Adventure of the Black Fisherman, Quidor's painting shows the 3 main characters: the miserly Dutchman, the sinister German sorcerer, with his divining rod at his feet, and the superstitious black fisherman, digging for treasure in a New York cemetery. The Smiths' neighbors in Manchester testify to their use of magic circles and magic formulae in the attempt to dislodge buried treasure from their guardian spirits. One night, William Stafford, who lived about a mile south of the Smiths on Stafford Road, was visited by Joseph Sr., who invited him to participate in a treasure dig. He informed Stafford that Joseph Jr. had seen in his stone 2 or 3 kegs of gold and silver, located not many rods from Smith's house, and that he and Stafford were the only 2 men who could get the treasure. Making their way through the dark, they arrived at the place of deposit. Stafford probably held the lantern as Joseph Sr. drew a circle in the dirt, 12 or 14 feet in diameter, and then explained that the treasure was located in the center. Joseph Sr. took some witch hazel stakes and drove them into the ground at regular intervals around the circle, as he explained, for keeping off the evil spirits. Within this barrier, he drew another inner circle, about 8 or 10 feet in diameter, then walked around 3 times on the periphery of this last circle, muttering to himself something which I could not understand, Stafford recalled. Next, he drove a steel rod in the center of the circles in order to prevent the treasure from moving. Smith ordered silence, lest we should arouse the evil spirit who had the charge of these treasures. Then the two men began digging. They continued until they dug a trench about 5 feet in depth around the rod. Believing they had isolated the treasure in a cone of earth, they tore into the mound, hoping to be faster than the treasure guardian. But the treasure was gone. Puzzled, Smith went to the house to ask young Joseph why they had failed. He soon returned, explaining to Stafford that Joseph had remained all this time in the house, looking in his stone and watching the motions of the evil spirit, that he saw the spirit come up to the ring, and as soon as it had beheld the cone which we had formed around the rod, it caused the money to sink. When the two men returned to the house together, Father Joseph observed that we had made a mistake in the commencement of the operation, and if it had not been for that, said he, we should have got the money. At Joseph Smith's 1826 trial, testimony was given about his locating buried treasure with his seer stone, and the treasure not being obtained due to its enchantment and moving away. Jonathan Thompson, a believer in Smith's gift, testified that after digging several feet, they struck upon something sounding like a board or plank, whereupon he asked Smith to look in his stone, but Smith refused, stating that he was alarmed the last time he looked on account of the circumstances relating to the trunk being buried, which came all fresh to his mind, that the last time he looked, he discovered distinctly the two Indians who buried the trunk, that a quarrel ensued between them, and that one of said Indians was killed by the other, and thrown into the hole beside the trunk, to guard it, as he supposed. Thompson went on to say that the board he struck his spade upon was probably the chest, but on account of an enchantment, the trunk kept settling away from under them while digging, that notwithstanding they continued constantly removing the dirt, yet the trunk kept about the same distance from them. Manchester resident Willard Chase and Joseph Knight, a Smith family friend and early Mormon convert from Colesville, New York, corroborate Lucy's story. Chase, who heard the account from Joseph Sr. in 1827, said in 1833 that Joseph removed the plates from the box, but fearing someone might discover where he got it, he laid it down to place the top stone as he found it, and turning around, to his surprise, there was no book in sight. Knight said he was told that Joseph had disobeyed the command to take the book and go right away, but set the plates down, only to discover moments later that they had disappeared. Both Chase and Knight tell about Joseph removing the stone and discovering that the plates had miraculously returned to their place. They also mention Joseph trying to remove them again. However, Knight's account fails to mention that Joseph was struck, but instead states that he could not stir the book any more than he could the mountain. Chase's account is similar to Lucy's, but takes the story a step closer to folk magic tales about gnomes and treasure guardians. He remembered that Joseph Sr. told him that Joseph again opened the box and in it saw the book and attempted to take it out, but was hindered. He saw in the box something like a toad, which soon assumed the appearance of a man and struck him on the side of his head. Not being discouraged at trifles, he again stooped down and strove to take the book, when the spirit struck him again and knocked him 3 or 4 rods and hurt him prodigiously. Chase's account is supported by Benjamin Saunders, Lorenzo's younger brother, who said he heard Joseph tell his mother and sister in 1827 that when he took the plates, there was something down near the box that looked something like a toad that rose up into a man, which forbid him to take the plates. Despite some variances in the details, the story that Joseph told was clearly one that dramatized the treasure seeker's expectations. regarding gnomes and other treasure guardians who lurked just outside their magic circles. As treasure lore had it, these spirit beings could transform themselves into whatever animal they pleased. In this case, the creature Joseph said resembled a toad was not a real toad. Neither was it like any animal he had seen before and could name. Nevertheless, the toad had long been associated with witchcraft, evil spirits, and the casting of magical spells. One of young Joseph's occult mentors, Lumen Walters, reportedly, in addition to reading from a Latin book, drawing circles with a rusty sword, and scrying with a stone, also used a stuffed toad as a prop. The idea that the messenger could assume animal form seems to be reflected in David Whitmer's statement that after transporting Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery from Harmony to Fayette in June 1829, he was impressed that the angel was under his father's shed, which was confirmed by Smith. Knight and Chase
Hold on, let me. Oh, 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 oh. Hello? There we go. You can hear me? Hello? Yeah. Okay. All right, let's do, this should be our last bit of reading for this. Oh no, it's not the last bit of reading for this. Excuse me. Okay. Okay. Let's do a little bit more reading. Hello? Good. Okay, give me 1 second. Hold on. Okay. One individual fits this description of a cult mentor identified by Quinn Dr. Lumen Walters. Dr. Lumen Walters, reputed by a physician and magician, the two were sometimes closely associated in that age. Walter is known to have been in Joseph's and his family's circle of acquaintances prior to 1827. He was also a distant cousin of Joseph's future wife, Emma Hale. As Quinn notes, Brigham Young's describes the unnamed New York magician as having traveling extensively through Europe to obtain profound learning, and others identified Walters as a physician who studied mesmerism in Europe before meeting Joseph Smith. Walter family records and legends called him a clairvoyant. If these statements are generally accurate, Walter had considerable knowledge of Hermetic tradition. During this period in Europe, and to a lesser degree in America, a physician with interest in mesmerism, magic, clairvoyance, and profound learning moved in a milieu nurtured by the legacies of Hermeticism. By definition, such a physician stood in a tradition dominated by the medical and esoteric writings of Paraclesis, steeped in alchemy and associated closely with Rosicrucian philosophy. As an individual who's interested in hidden treasures, Walter might have taken particular note of Paraclesis' admonition on Kabbalah's import. All of you who see land beyond the horizon, who read sealed, hidden missives and books, who seek for buried treasure in the earth and in walls, you who teach so much wisdom, such high arts, remember that you must take unto yourselves the teachings of the Kabbalah if you want to accomplish all this. For the Kabbalah builds on a true foundation. Prayer and it will be given to you. Pray and it will be given to you. Knock and you will be heard. The gate will be open to you. Everything you desire will flow and be granted to you. you will see into the greatest depths of the earth. The art of Kabbalah is beholden to God, it is in alliance with Him, and it is found on the words of Christ. But if you do not follow the true doctrine of the Kabbalah, but slip into geomancy, you will be led by that spirit which tells you nothing but lies. Geomancy, earth. Geomancy sounds more scientific than. Hold on. Geomancy sounds better than. Geomancy sounds better than Kabbalah. If Walter did have contact with the young Smith, he might have shared some interesting ideas about the occult reformative tradition that had for 3 centuries been a force working on the creative edge of Western religious imagination. Concepts which might have influenced a prophetic imagination. Here's the tentative early connection to a legacy of ancient priesthoods, lost books, sacred weddings, modern seers, co-eternal matter, golden treasures, angelic messengers, rebuilt temples, drawing dispensations, and God's glorious intelligence. Perhaps Walter might even have had something to say about the story of the 16-year-old Christian Rosenkreutz who journeyed to the east and translated the Book of M, only to be rejected by the learned of his age. This was a legacy of ideas about man and God, unlike anything in the texts of revivalism and Seekerism sweeping New York's burned-over district, and yet so much like the religion embraced by the prophets to be. In addition to early influence from a possible occult mentor such as Walter, other eddies of Hermetic mythos swirled near the young Joseph Smith. Quinn notes Pennsylvania was the focal point of ceremonial magic in early America, and several sources indicate that Joseph Jr. engaged in folk magic activities during the summers of the 1820s away from Palmyra, often in Pennsylvania. What Smith encountered in Pennsylvania may again be better termed Hermeticism than folk magic. There is even some possibility that he had direct contact with Rosicrucian ideas. German pietists German pietists who had emigrated to Pennsylvania in the previous century were German pietists who had immigrated to Pennsylvania in the previous century were deeply influenced by Rosicrucianism and the Kabbalistically flavored mysticism of Jacob Boehme. The first American Rosicrucian group had been founded in Wizencock Creek near Philadelphia just before 1700 by a learned band of Theosophists and German Pietists headed by Johannes Cleepus. In 1720, the German mystic and Pietist Johann Conrad Bezel immigrated to Pennsylvania seeking to join that group. He subsequently associated himself with a few of the remaining Wyzechicon mystics and later originated a Rosicrucian society, the Ephrata Commune, near Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Alderfer notes in his book of the movement Epiphrata itself, though an inheritor of many strains of mysticism, was a latter-day heaven of essentially Gnostic ideas and terminology. The community survived into the early 19th century. During its peak in the mid-18th century, it proselytized widely, sending disciples on pilgrimages through the surrounding countryside and even into New England. Alchemy, Kabbalah, and perhaps Freemasonry all played roles in the mystical philosophy taught at Ephrata. A few tentative evidences suggesting loose association of Smith was Rosicrucianism and perhaps even some residuals of the Ephrata commune are introduced by Quinn. But specific contacts aside, one must recognize that the sophisticated Rosicrucian Kabbalistic and alchemical ideals represented at Ephrata had been quilted into Pennsylvania esoteric lore for over 100 years prior to Joseph's summer visits in 1820s. If Smith did have contact with individuals influenced by these traditions, of which there must have been more than a few, his kingdom of things hermetic, Kabbalistic, and alchemical would have been augmented. Joseph Smith's possible direct exposure to Kabbalah before 1840 deserves specific comment. I will later discuss in detail the studies in Nauvoo. The role of Kabbalah in magic was preserving enough even that with a curtailed involvement in ceremonial magic, Smith would have heard of the subject. Paracelsus' admonition to treasure seekers, quoted above, represents the importance with which Kabbalistic knowledge was imbued by occultists. In fact, in the period's vocabulary, Kabbalah was often used as a synonym for magic and occultism. Those Christian esotericists who knew of Kabbalah in early 19th century would have known it particularly through Christianized interpretations, by then thoroughly amalgamated with Hermetic, alchemical, and Rosicrucian notions. While in occasion American occultists might have had some knowledge of Kabbalah in its original Jewish form. Study at this basic level required some knowledge of Hebrew, access to original Hebrew Kabbalistic texts, or the Latin translations in the Kabbalah Den Dudata, and at least in traditional view, an adept Kabbalist as guide. Nonetheless, with the context of prevalent transmission, it is possible Joseph encountered and took interest in some outlines of Kabbalah. The most basic form available to him would have been simple representations of the tree of Sephiroth found in the Hermetic works published in the early 17th and 18th century. This depiction of the Sephiroth structure in the divine life ideas, which perfused Hermetic ideas and symbols, and which were like those developed in Mormon theology. The power of this archetypical pattern of the Sephiroth to stimulate a religious imagination is witnessed by occasional later Christian Kabbalistic works, some of which appear to be almost entirely free from association, built from meditations on this structure of the Sephiroth and devoid of any relation to traditional Jewish or Christian Kabbalistic commentaries. In this vein, the work recently published by Mormon author Joe Sampson is interesting. Sampson evaluated Joseph Smith's writings, including the Book of Mormon and Doctrine and Covenants, and noted a pattern of word and concept usage in several verses which reproduced both the common English names and general hierarchical structure of the Kabbalistic tree of Sephiroth. While Sampson carried his argument beyond what a less intuitive student might discern, several of his examples deserve consideration. And though this Kabbalistic pattern in Smith's revelatory writings may be accidental, it also could suggest some earlier exposure, at least to the concept of the tree of Sephiroth. Sampson extended his thesis by suggesting that Smith's translation of the Book of Abraham from the Egyptian papyrus with a Kabbalistic work in the classic scene. Though Sampson development of this argument is itself cryptically and Kabbalistic, this theme again deserves scrutiny. Kabbalah was, as he notes, this tradition of prophetic interpretation. It encouraged a creative rereading of sacred texts in the quest for a return to the primary vision, which was the single source of knowledge in scripture. In nature, if not in context, Smith's translation of the Book of Mormon, his retranslation of Genesis, and his interpretation of the Book of Abraham, papyri, all can be seen as expressions of the primary interpretation vision Kabbalah mandated from the prophetic consciousness. Whether this was a reflection of Joseph's contact with Kabbalah or just Joseph's remains an open question, but beyond a doubt, this interpretive activity fits within the evolved Hermetic Kabbalistic vision of a true prophet's work. Okay.
Chase mention another detail that is absent from Lucy's account. After recovering from his fright, Chase said, Joseph inquired why he could not obtain the plates, to which the spirit made reply, because you have not obeyed your orders. He then inquired when he could have them, and was answered thus, Come 1 year from this day, and bring with you your oldest brother, and you shall have them. Knight gave a similar account, stating that Joseph exclaimed, Why can't I stir this book? And he was answered, You have not done right. You should have took the book and gone right away. You can't have it now. Joseph says, When can I have it? The answer was, The 22nd day of September next, if you bring the right person with you. Joseph says, Who is the right person? The answer was, your oldest brother. The requirement to bring Alvin the following year was also mentioned by others, like Lorenzo Saunders and Fayette Latham, the latter of whom interviewed Joseph Smith Sr. in 1830. However, this element may have been added by Joseph Jr. in 1824 to explain why he had failed a second time to get the plates. The Smith family soon forgot their religious differences as they gathered nightly to hear Joseph Jr.'s stories. Lucy reports that we sat up very late and listened attentively to all that he had to say to us. On the night following Joseph's first trip to the hill, Alvin suggested that the family get up early the next morning in order to finish their labor an hour earlier than usual, thus having more time in the evening to hear more of Joseph's account. The following day, the family pursued their labors with excited anticipation for what they might hear that evening. At last, just before sunset, Lucy recalled that the family was ready to be seated and give our undivided attention to Joseph's recitals. Joseph charged them with secrecy about the gold plates. Brother William remembered that the whole family were melted to tears and believed all he said. Joseph quickly emerged from his former stance of quiet observer to the center of attention at these nightly gatherings. Every evening we gathered our children together, Lucy recalled, all seated in a circle, father, mother, sons, and daughters, listening in breathless anxiety to the religious teachings of a boy 17 years of age. This was a creative time for Joseph. In the course of our evening conversations, Lucy said, Joseph would give us some of the most amusing recitals which could be imagined. He would describe the ancient inhabitants of this continent, their dress, their manner of traveling, the animals which they rode, the cities that were built by them, the structures of their buildings, with every particular of their mode of warfare, their religious worship, as particularly as though he had spent his life with them. Clearly, Joseph was honing his talent as a storyteller. Even without the gold plates, Joseph's recitals produced the desired effect. We were convinced that God was about to bring to light something that we might stay our minds upon, something that we could get a more definite idea of than anything which had been taught us heretofore, and we rejoiced in it with exceeding great joy. The sweetest union and happiness pervaded our house, and no jar nor discord disturbed our peace, and tranquillity reigned in our midst. Indeed, in light of Joseph's important errand, their former problems seemed trivial. On the 19th of November, 1823, less than 2 months following Joseph Jr.'s necromantic encounter on the hill, Alvin died of an apparent intestinal blockage. Lucy said that Alvin manifested a greater zeal and anxiety than any of the rest of the family with regard to the record. He always showed the most intense interest concerning the matter, but mention of the gold plates was painful in the wake of his death. Lucy recalled that whenever Joseph spoke of the plates, it would immediately bring Alvin to our minds with all his kindness, his affection, his zeal and piety. And when we looked to his place and realized that he was gone from it, to return no more in this life, we all wept with one accord for our irretrievable loss, and we could not be comforted because he was not. Consequently, Lucy said, we could not bear to hear anything said upon the subject. Thus, Joseph had lost his central place in the family's evening conversations. As stated, it is unclear at what point Joseph told his family that Alvin's presence was required to obtain the plates. Was Alvin, on his deathbed, aware that the angel had required his presence on the hill the following year, Did he know the possible implications of his instruction to Joseph to do everything that lays in your power to obtain the records? Or had Joseph held back the requirement for Alvin's presence until 1824, when he explained to his family the reason for his second failure? Regardless, it may not have been intended that Joseph would ever actually get the plates. He may have been satisfied for the time being with simply narrating his conversations with the messenger, which, according to Lucy, he continued to receive from time to time. As he would later demonstrate, he could see the plates and the translation in his stone without the plates being present. In any event, following his visit to the hill in September 1824, he once again returned to his family with disappointing news. Within days of Joseph's unsuccessful visit to the hill, Joseph Sr. exhumed Alvin's body under the pretext of settling for himself a vicious rumor that Alvin had been removed from the place of his interment and dissected. In a notice to the public that was printed in the Wayne Sentinel and dated 25th of September, 1824, Joseph Smith Sr. announced that for the purpose of ascertaining the truth of such reports, I, with some of my neighbors, this morning, repaired to the grave, and removing the earth, found the body which had not been disturbed. The timing of this event suggests that the controversy over Alvin's body was in some way connected with the messenger's requirement. Were the rumors the result of neighborhood speculation about the extent to which the Smiths would go to get the gold plates, forcing Joseph Sr. to prove such was not the case? According to Lucy, Joseph Jr. had told the family to keep the circumstances of his discovery of the plates to themselves. However, Joseph Sr.'s explanation for disinterring Alvin's body is questionable, because one should have been able to determine if the grave had been recently disturbed without exhuming the body. It seems probable, therefore, that Joseph Sr. himself may have been the source of the rumor that the story was a ruse to exhume Alvin's body for its use in attempting to get the gold plates. Perhaps Joseph Sr.'s exuberance resurfaced as it had the previous year when he told his son, "I would have taken them if I had been in your place." Was he refusing to give up? If so, the incident would demonstrate how thoroughly the father believed his son's claims. Both Lucy and Joseph Jr., in their narratives, skipped over the latter's 1824 visit to the hill. But Willard Chase said that when Joseph appeared without Alvin, the messenger told him he could not have the plates until he should come again in just 1 year and bring a man with him. On asking who might be the man, he was answered that he would know him when he saw him. This vague instruction afforded Joseph some flexibility in searching for Alvin's substitute, and 3 years passed before he finally named his wife, Emma, as the person who would accompany him to the hill. Nothing is known of his 1825 and 1826 visits to the hill outside of Smith's later claim to have made them. This brings into question whether he actually made annual visits, despite his inability to fulfill the messenger's requirement. During the revival of 1824-25, Lucy and her 3 oldest children joined the Presbyterian Church. Young Joseph also participated and was by his own admission partial to the Methodists. But when he discovered that his stories of communion with the dead were not well received, he withdrew and returned to his money digging. In the fall of 1825, according to Chase, he sent Hiram to borrow the stone again, claiming that Joseph needed it to accomplish some business of importance, which could not very well be done without the aid of the stone. As September 1825 neared, Joseph seemed to entertain the idea that fellow treasure seer Samuel T. Lawrence, might be a good candidate for Alvin's substitute. At least his close friendship with Lawrence led Willard Chase to arrive at such a conclusion. Joseph seemed to trust Lawrence with information he otherwise withheld from other treasure seekers, even showing him the location of the gold plates. However, Joseph quickly learned that Lawrence was a shrewd competitor. When he showed Lawrence the location of the plates, the latter apparently had brought his own seer stone, for Chase said that Lawrence asked Joseph if he had ever discovered anything with the plates of gold. Joseph said, "No." Lawrence then asked him to look in his stone to see if there was anything with them. Joseph looked, but said he could see nothing. Lawrence told him to look again and see if there was not a large pair of specks with the plates. Joseph looked and soon saw a pair of spectacles, the same with which Joseph says he translated the Book of Mormon. This became an added element to the original story. Indeed, the spectacles would subsequently play a brief role in Smith's translation of the gold plates. Not long after this, according to Chase, Joseph altered his mind and said Lawrence was not the right man, nor had he, Joseph, told him the right place. Of course, Joseph had no intention of making Lawrence, his rival, a substitute for Alvin. More likely, Joseph was merely hoping to get additional testimony to support the existence of the plates. If he could not get the plates, he would at least get testimony of their existence. However, he did not anticipate Lawrence's response. His friend not only confirmed the existence of the plates, but then sought to establish his own seeric abilities above and beyond Smith's. Joseph would not get what he wanted from Lawrence without a price. He had no choice but to confirm, albeit reluctantly, the existence of the spectacles Lawrence said he saw. Thus, Joseph received his first witness to the existence of the plates, and Lawrence secured from Joseph a testimony of his own exceptional gift. Joseph had much to learn from the older, more experienced seers. Although Lawrence is listed as being in his 40s in the 1830 Palmyra census, his whereabouts after 1833 are unknown. When Philastus Hurlbut visited the Palmyra area in late 1833 to interview the Smiths' former neighbors, Lawrence was evidently unavailable. On the 17th of April, 1833, a Samuel T. Lawrence was indicted for fraudulently secreting property and ordered to appear at court. It may be that in an effort to bolster his seeric claims, Lawrence resorted to hiding a neighbor's property and then pretending to find it. That no subsequent record of the trial appears in the docket indicates that Lawrence perhaps chose to leave the area rather than to face the charges. In the accounts that emanated from Joseph Smith in 1832, 1834 through 35, and 1838, there seems to be a conscious effort to downplay the folk magic context of the original story. In 1838, for instance, he said he found the plates because of the distinctness of the vision which I had had concerning it. Other accounts, including those of Willard Chase and Martin Harris, report that Smith found them by using his seer stone. Chase said that during the fall of 1827, Smith confessed to him that if it had not been for that stone, which he acknowledged belonged to me, he would not have obtained the book. In none of Smith's accounts were the plates removed from the box. Consequently, in these versions, he does not disobey the orders by setting the plates on the ground, nor do the plates seem enchanted when they disappear and magically reappear inside the box. In 1832, Smith said he went to the hill and straightway made 3 attempts to take the plates, but failing, he became exceedingly frightened. In Oliver Cowdery's account, written under Smith's guidance in 1835, Joseph experienced 3 successive shocks, each more powerful than the previous. Aware of Eber D. Howe's publication of affidavits from Smith's former New York neighbors, including Willard Chase, Cowdery admits that Smith initially interpreted these shocks within a treasure-seeking context, stating that Smith had heard of the power of enchantment and 1,000 like stories, which held the hidden treasures of the earth, and supposed that physical exertion and personal strength was only necessary to enable him to yet obtain the object of his wish, and therefore persisted in his attempt to get the plates. In his 1838 history, Smith reduced the event to, "I made an attempt to take them out, but was forbidden by the messenger." An important element in the story that more than anything pointed 19th century minds towards treasure lore was the claim that the plates were protected by the spirit of a dead mortal. As D. Michael Quinn has noted, it was not customary in Joseph Smith's day to use angel to describe a personage who had been mortal, had died, and was returning to earth to give a message to someone, while at the same time, the visit of a spirit messenger to a human was common in magic and familiar to folk perceptions. When Abner Cole said in 1831 that Joe Smith never pretended to have any communion with angels until a long period after the pretended finding of his book, he was claiming that there was a shift in meaning between 1823 and 1827, which very well may be true. Cole had earlier said Joe made league with the spirit who afterwards turned out to be an angel. Obviously, for Cole, angels were distinct beings from ghosts or the spirits of dead mortals. Evidently, Joseph Smith expanded his definition of angel to include a particular treasure guardian, while Lucy and other family members make it clear that God was involved from the start. The word angel is anachronistic to the 1823 setting. Like his mother, Joseph also failed to mention the requirement to bring Alvin. Making impossible demands is what one would expect from a treasure guardian, and it provided a plausible reason for not obtaining the plates. In retrospect, as the story departed further from its folk magical origins, it became increasingly difficult to explain why God's messenger would not have foreseen Alvin's death. If Joseph's first vision failed to secure his father's full attention, this recital did. Joseph had learned to speak his father's language. Joseph's 1823 recital drew from symbols available in Joseph Sr.'s world: seer stones, dreams, guardian spirits, and enchanted treasures. Like Joseph Sr.'s early dreams recounted by Lucy, young Joseph said he had a remarkable dream in which an attendant spirit told him about a box that contained wisdom and understanding. Upon finding the container, Joseph was confronted by something that frightened him, not the host of threatening beasts that caused his father to flee for his life, but a toad-like creature that transformed itself into the spirit of a little old man who struck him. That Joseph's 1823 encounters with the spirit over the gold book essentially supported Joseph Sr.'s dreams was recognized by Abner Cole, editor of the Palmyra Reflector, who understood in 1831 that the spirit's tidings corresponded precisely with the revelations made to and predictions made by the elder Smith a number of years before. How could Joseph Sr. not believe this account?
Hello? Hello, is it working? Okay, it's working. Give me 1 second. I'm just doing something, and then we'll do our final reading for today. Okay. The section on Mormonism on Be Wise as Serpents is getting pretty big now. It's getting there. Yeah, it's definitely growing. Okay. The Prophet and Freemasonry. Whatever one concludes about the varied hints of scattered early associations with with Hermeticism, Joseph Smith had well-documented connections with one of the tradition's major legacies, Masonry. The Prophet's association with the Masonic tradition are thoroughly documented and discussed by Michael W. Homer in his issue of Dialogue. It is unlikely that Smith would have so fully involved himself and his church with the Masonic tradition if he had not sensed there in some intrinsic compatibility with his own religion making vision. As Homer demonstrates, the prophet said that Masonry was taken from the priesthood, and his followers continued quoting that observation for 50 years after. It is possible that Joseph's interpretation of Masonry as a legacy of ancient priesthood was based on his own understanding of history extending back hundreds of years, a history intertwined with Hermetic mythos and with Kabbalah, alchemy, and Rosicrucianism. The alliance of this occult legacy with Masonry was well understood by the esoterically inclined Masons. Assertions of such links were bandied about by American anti-Masonic publications in the late 1820s, and noted Joseph's own history several times touched Hermetic Kabbalistic traditions. One could argue that even interacted with them in a creative visionary sense. Joseph's contacts with the Hermetic mythos were sufficient to generate vague assumptions about Masonry's earlier roots, and these assumptions could have been an historical subtext to his remarks about Masonry being remnant of ancient priesthood. Interestingly, modern historical examination of the occult tradition suggests a shadow of truth in Joseph's statement, Kabbalah and Hermeticism as respectives of an historical stream as respectives of an historical stream of occult knowledge, or as a reservoir of Gnosticism, did claim ancient lineages of priesthood. Joseph had every reason to take those claims seriously, as do historians today, albeit within a narrower interpretive context. In this light, Joseph's connection to Masonry takes on several different shades of meaning. The ubiquitous influence of Kabbalah upon the occult traditions of the 19th century has been stressed, but its specific import in Masonry requires repeated emphasis. Noted historians of occultism Arthur Edward Waite suggested in his 1923 Encyclopedia of Freemasonry that much of the great and incomprehensible hearts of Masonry came from Kabbalah, the secret tradition of Israel. He finds such important Masonic symbols as the lost word, the Temple of Solomon, the pillars, Jachin and Boaz, the concept of master builder, the restoration of Zion, all derived from the lore of Kabbalah. The organizer of Scottish Rite Freemasonry and the America Albert Pike manifested a similar sentiment and indexed over 70 entries to the subject of Kabbalah in his classic 19th century study, Morals and Dogmas of the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. Though Pike's work was published in 1871, his views reflected lore already established in Masonry during the period of Joseph Smith's Masonic initiationist 3 decades earlier. Indeed, one of the earliest documentary mentions of Masonry appear in 1691, specifically linked it with these Jewish traditions. As Homer wrote notes, the Scottish Rite developed by Pike was an evolution of the 18th century French Masonic Rite de Perfection, which in several degrees influenced by Kabbalah. Kabbalah's importance in Masonic lore is also witnessed by Martinez de Pasquale and his late 18th century Kabbalistic Masonic restoration of ancient priesthood and the Order of Les Ulis Kohen. Much of the Kabbalistic influence upon Masonry may have come from Rosicrucianism, again recalling their close association initiation, infused as it was with alchemical and Kabbalistic symbolism, but some additional influence might be attributed to esoteric sources like the Frankist movement, the Frankist followers of Jacob Frank, and the successors of the Kabbalistically inclined Sabbatine heresy had become active in Central European Masonic organizations in the late 18th century. Given the wide diffusion of the Christianized and Rosicrucian version of Kabbalah into Masonry, Joseph Smith probably heard something about the tradition during the course of his almost 20 years associated with Masons and Freemasonry. It might be argued that these occult Masonic inclinations were all part of the sophisticated esoteric form of European Masonry foreign to the world of frontier America. To the contrary, and though not yet fully investigated, there are several reasons to believe that what Joseph Smith encountered in Nauvoo was an esoteric interpretation of Masonry. As mentioned earlier, between 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, a multitude of occult orders arose from Masonry. Each of these tended to develop its own interrelated systems of symbolic ceremonies for conveying distinct esoteric visions. The different rites also often claimed variant authentic Masonic origins. In ancient Egyptian mysteries, in the lineages of the medieval Knights Templar and Kabbalistic transmissions, and in the Hermetic alchemical Rosicrucian traditions, Robert McCoy's 1872 Encyclopedia of Freemasonry cataloged over 45 distinct systems of Masonic rites developed during the period from 1750 to 1820. In retrospect, one might suggest that during this unusual epoch, a creatively elite group of individuals coming from many sectors of society encountered in the Masonic mythos a new medium for expressing their visions. Though basic York rites or Blue Lodge Masonry, with its 3 degrees, was a common grounding for most of these, around that foundation appeared many layers of esoteric accretions, with the tools of allegory, symbol, and imagination, and in a format suggesting great mysterious antiquity. Men touched by the Masonic myth began producing new ancient rituals. One is reminded of Irenaeus' complaint about the Gnostic responding to the creative muse of their times. Every one of them generates something new day by day according to his ability, for no one is deemed mature who is not developed some mighty fiction. John C. Bennett, one of the more enigmatic figures in Mormon history, was the indisputable impetus to Masonry's introduction in Nauvoo. Bennett's mercurial career among the Mormons has fascinated and bewildered historians. Seemingly from out of the blue, Bennett appeared in Nauvoo and was baptized into the Mormon Church in the summer of 1840. Within less than a year, he became mayor of Nauvoo, chancellor of the University of Nauvoo, major general of the Nauvoo Legion, assistant president of the Mormon Church, and an intimate friend and counselor to Joseph Smith. In June 1841, less than 3 months after becoming assistant president, he began attempts to organize a Mormon Masonic lodge, but the masonry he brought to Nauvoo had several unusual occult aspects. Less than a year later, he made an equally dramatic exit communication amid a flurry of allegations suggesting widespread sexual improprieties. By the time he arrived in Nauvoo, the 35-year-old Bennett had attended Athens State University, studied medicine with his uncle, the prominent frontier doctor and Ohio historian, Dr. Samuel Hildreth. He helped to found educational institutions in West Virginia, India, and Ohio, organized a Willoughby College, the medical school, and served as first dean and professor of gynecology and children's disease, been a licensed preacher in Ohio, been appointed brigadier general of the Illinois Invincible Dragoons, and in 1840 become quartermaster general of Illinois State Militia. He had also apparently abandoned a wife and children, been ejected from at least one Masonic lodge for unbecoming behavior, and been accused of selling medical degrees. Bennett's interests, including religion, medicine, the military, and masonry, suggest a person inclined towards investigating the most esoteric aspects of masonry. His apparent libidinous proclivity may also have aroused his curiosity about Orthodox unorthodox sexual practices associated with more creative Masonic rites. Given given the relationship between Bennett and Smith, Bennett probably had communicated some Masonic ideas to Smith before petitions were made for the formation of the Nauvoo Masonic Lodge in 1841. That the temple endowment ceremony developed by Smith in May 1842 was influenced by Masonry cannot escape notice, but beyond the temple endowment, several other components were developing in Joseph's vision during this period. That sounded an even stranger resonance with ideas from the esoteric Masonic quarter. Two stand out: organization of the Order of Illuminati or Political Kingdom of God, and introduction of spiritual wifery. Okay, that should be it for now. That should be it. And we're going to finish this tomorrow. All right, guys. Thank you for coming and thank you for watching. Bye.